The story begins when the main character is abandoned by her own family. Lady has always cared for the Ravel family because she loved them. Ms. Medina was in despair. She accused her daughter Adila of attempting to kill her older brother. The enraged lady believed that Adila was unworthy to be called her daughter. The Duke's daughter, Adila Ravel, was a child who craved the love of her family, but Adila's parents only adored their eldest son. To maintain his perfect status, they asked the girl to use magical powers every day, attributing all the merits to the boy. The lady also suffered humiliation from her husband. Moreover, even the servants treated the girl terribly, and the stepmother turned a blind eye to everything. No one respected or loved Adila. No matter what, Adila considered it her duty to preserve the honor of her family. But every patience eventually came to an end, and Adila, unfortunately, was no exception. After all the horrors, the main character became fascinated with black magic. She was executed by her own father for attempting to murder her older brother. The main problem was that after her death, the girl was reborn into that unfortunate main character. One day, Adila was being humiliated by the servants, as usual. She went a little overboard, which sent the main character flying into the wall. At that moment, her entire past life flashed before her eyes. The flood of memories was so strong that she could not stand it and lost consciousness. No one even called a doctor, despite the fact that Adila could have been seriously injured by such a blow. After the incident, a cheeky maid entered the lady's room. The servant pointed out that Adila was already 13 years old and had not yet learned to walk. The maid began to accuse the lady of being a daughter of the Ravel family and of being clumsy. This maid's name was Fauna. It was best not to argue with her again. She was the main bully among the servants. In fact, until a certain day, Adila did not remember anything about her past life. But after the blow, she remembered the entire plot of the novel. The girl already knew what awaited her ahead. Adila sadly realized that she would never be able to get any love or care from her family. The maid Fauna especially loved to tease the girl. The servant always brought the lady little food and called her a disgrace to the family. The maid also always stated the fact that Adila was only worthy of being washed. Adila recently remembered the entire plot of the novel, and she really didn't like it. The girl decided to take matters into her own hands because she didn't want to endure humiliation for the rest of her life. After Fauna humiliated the girl once again, she couldn't stand it anymore. Adila literally threw herself at the servant with her fists. It seemed that all the suffering and pain had accumulated in the lady. Another maid heard the noise in the room and ran to see what had happened. Seeing something fantastic, the servant rushed to Mr. Leo to tell him everything. Meanwhile, several maids watched as Adila gave Fani her first hard rebuff. The scene was impressive. The maid lay on the floor, and the lady lay directly on top of her and spanked her. The breakfast that Fauna brought was miserable. Adila decided to feed the servant with it. The lady succeeded in this successfully. No one could understand what had happened to such a calm and obedient girl. When Mr. Leo entered the room, he couldn't believe what he saw with his own eyes. His daughter was completely different. She had become confident, impudent, and someone who wouldn't let anyone wipe her feet. Adila hoped that after such a beautiful performance, her family would simply kick her out, and she would live like an ordinary person. The girl wanted to do everything so that her life would not be like in the novel. The whole family gathered at the table for dinner. Mr. Leo waited for his daughter to explain. The girl just smiled and asked her father not to judge her. Adila simply retaliated against the maid for always feeding her slop. Her father asked again what kind of food Fauna was serving his daughter. Adila repeated to her father once again that Fauna had been feeding her slop. The girl smiled discontentedly and realized that her father wasn't even interested in how his beloved daughter was living. But Mr. Leo slammed his hand on the table. He thought the girl shouldn't have complained. Brother Sharon intervened, pointing out that Adila didn't have any magic and didn't even know how to fence. The guy thought that a worthless person like his sister deserved no better treatment. Sharon, taking the maid's side, explained that the maids also needed to relieve stress. The boy indignantly explained that, unlike Adila, the maids worked hard. He asked his sister to be grateful that the women showed at least some care for her. Sharon believed that it was because of Adila that their family was ridiculed in high society. Everyone believed that the girl, the heiress of a great magician, did not even know how to cast spells. Since Adila was considered a disgrace to the family, the head of the family was supposed to be the older brother, Sharon. But it all happened because of the stepmother. Adila's real mother died in childbirth, and the role of the wife of the head of the Ravel house was taken by her stepmother, Medina. The woman wanted her blood son to become the head of the Ravel family, but Adila stood in her way. From early childhood, her stepmother explained to the girl that she was not suitable for the role of head of the family. The woman also said that this did not mean that the girl could not be useful to them. Medina offered Adila to help her older brother. The woman promised that if the girl did not stand out and use magic, her father, older brother, and she personally would love her with all their hearts. As a child, Adila believed a cunning woman. After her mother died, everything changed. No one was kind to the girl, and her father completely forgot about his daughter's existence. Everyone began to be controlled by a stepmother who took advantage of the weakness of a lonely little child. Adila Ravel was an ordinary girl who craved love from her family. One day, Adila approached Ms. Medina with a proposal to end the concert. The woman frankly did not understand what the girl was talking about. Adila said that since childhood, she was forbidden to use magic. All this was so that her older brother, Sharon, could become the head of the Ravel family. The frightened woman began to refute the girl's words. Sharon laughed, saying that was the stupidest thing he had ever heard in his life. He accused his sister of being completely out of her mind. As an alternative, the young man suggested that Adila destroy the largest oak tree in their garden with the help of his magic. He did not believe in his sister's powers at all. But something incredible happened. In a matter of seconds, Adila released fire from her hands, which destroyed the tree. The guy, lowering his head, indicated that he was taking back his words and admitted his guilt. Adila was surprised because it was the first time she had received an apology from her older brother. Later, the girl asked her entire family to apologize to her for all the years of miserable treatment. Medina wondered if the girl had begun to study dark magic at some point. If so, the woman was ready to understand why Adila hid her abilities. Suddenly, the woman had an idea. She publicly admitted that the girl had hidden her powers because she was studying forbidden magic. At that very moment, water poured onto Medina's face. Adila sworn that every time someone spoke obvious nonsense, she would pour water on them. The girl admitted that she had not studied any forbidden techniques. Adila also added that it was her stepmother who had kept her silent all this time. The girl found it funny that Medina had decided to play a false comedy in front of everyone. The girl literally poked her relatives in the nose that she could control magical power, but in return, she received accusations that she was somehow connected to dark magic. The people around Adila disliked her so much that they couldn't even look at her from the other side. Surprisingly, Sharon sided with her sister, noting that she would never have started studying dark magic. Adila was quite surprised, because her brother's behavior was completely atypical. The guy explained that there was no logic in the accusations. With Adila's magical potential, she could have studied dark magic, but she spent all her time within the walls of the estate. Sharon believed that if his father continued to insist on his way, he would look like a real idiot. The young man was convinced that in order to study the subject of magic, books were needed, which were not in the house. Sharon pointed out that the servants would not have bought anything like that for Adila. The young man concluded that the Ravel family hid books on the dark arts in their house. The young man thought that one must be so stupid to bury oneself in such a way. Happy Adila threw herself into her brother's arms. The girl hugged the young man tightly, thanking him for at least taking her side. Sharon asked to let him go, explaining that he was simply putting the prosperity of the Ravel family first. Adila was happy, because she and her brother had never been on the same side before, and it was wonderful. Suddenly, the young man turned his frowning gaze to his mother. Sharon finally realized that it was his mother who had forced the girl to hide her gift, and he was interested in the reasons. The woman sighed and happily noted that it was all for his sake, for the sake of her only son. Medina had done everything for the boy since his birth, but one day, Adila interfered with her plans. The woman believed that her son was more suitable for the role of head of the family than Adila. The lady tried so hard for her boy's happiness and asked him to understand her. Enraged, Sharon splashed a stream of water in her mother's face. The boy had spent years studying earth magic and hadn't used water magic in a long time. His father couldn't understand why his son would do such a thing, pouring water on his own mother. Sharon looked sternly at his mother and asked her to listen. The boy offered to become the head of the Ravel family, but on the condition that he fight Adila in a fair fight. The boy didn't want other people's handouts. Suddenly, Sharon felt uneasy because he realized that his mother didn't trust him so much that she decided to make him the head of the family in a cunning and dirty way. Sharon asked his mother in a rude and disgruntled tone why she simply didn't believe him. From such pressure from his son, Medina lost consciousness. The father immediately asked Adila for forgiveness for everything she had been through. The man scolded himself for not believing his own daughter. Mr. Leo regretted that he had allowed his wife and servants to treat Adila so rudely and cruelly. As an apology, he was ready to do anything his daughter wanted. Adila lowered her gaze. She felt sorry that her father had become kind as soon as he found out about everything. He should have shown his care and kindness earlier. The lady did not want to accept the apology. The girl tried to control herself because she couldn't give in to anger. Adila's main task was to leave her family as soon as possible. Adila decided to ask her father for permission to renounce the Ravel family. This decision was to please both Medina and Sharon's older brother. The girl was ready to give her brother the role of head of the family. Everyone in high society considered Adila to be untalented, and she was convinced that her abdication would not reflect on the reputation of the Ravel family. Mr. Leo categorically refused his daughter's plan. He was not going to expel his own child, especially if she had enormous magical potential. Sharon asked her sister to think about her husband, Duke Beck. The girl shook her head, remembering that she was only 13 years old. The girl's fiancé, the son of the ducal estate of Beck Valero according to the novel, was supposed to return at that time in Adila's life. The girl jumped up and headed towards the door. Adila had no intention of linking her life with such a monster as Valero. The lady intended to break off her engagement to Duke Valero, as she had no intention of marrying him. To prevent her daughter from doing anything stupid, her father decided to lock her in a room. He couldn't allow the girl to appear in Beck County in such a state. The father was afraid that his daughter would simply kill Valero with her magic. The man wondered why Adila didn't like Valero so much. As far as Mr. Leo could remember, his daughter had never met him. But the girl knew very well what kind of man Valero was. It was precisely because Valero was a disgrace to his family that Adila's relatives decided to conclude a marriage contract with the Beck family. The man came from a family of the strongest swordsmen in the empire. Valero was not bothered by anything in that world. All the man did was idle and teach others about life. So his parents decided that the untalented daughter of the Ravel family and the untalented son of the Beck family would make a wonderful couple. The father still asked his daughter to calm down, because he understood that she was that age now and hormones were playing a role. But the girl was not going to calm down. Mr. Leo promised to discuss everything over dinner in the evening. Adila lay down on the bed, exhausted and deep in thought. Everyone learned about her power, but her relatives still didn't care about her feelings. The girl realized that having magical powers wouldn't change anything. Since her father wasn't going to change, Adila decided to do everything in defiance. Despite the ban on leaving the room through the door, no one said that she couldn't climb out the window. Adila was ready to break off the engagement by any means. The worried girl looked out the window, and the height there turned out to be quite high. It occurred to the lady that she could fly out on a broomstick. Adila had never flown on a broomstick, so this was no easy task for her. However, the desire to break off relations with Valero was much stronger, so the girl flew away without hesitation. Very quickly, Adila found herself in the county of Beck. The young man, who was calmly drinking tea, almost choked when he saw the girl flying on a broomstick. Adila did not know how to land, so as expected, she fell. Valero could not understand what kind of lady had come to him. The girl introduced herself as Adila and explained that she was his future bride. The young man's mouth dropped open in surprise. He realized that the same talentless daughter of the Ravel family was standing before him. Suddenly, the young man hit the lady in the face. As it turned out, Valero had been waiting for the day when he would finally be able to meet his bride and conquer her. Adila just blinked silently. The young man could not understand why the lady was silent. He demanded an immediate apology for Adila breaking the window of his estate. The girl expected nothing else from the young man. Valero was behaving miserably. Adila couldn't understand why her father still had questions, why she didn't want to marry the boy. Since Adila was indeed to blame for breaking the window, she quickly apologized. The boy was the second son of the Beck family and did not understand why the ladies treated him so disdainfully. Unexpectedly, Valero asked for a proper apology. In that case, he agreed not to tell his father about what his fiancé had done. Valero threatened the lady that if she did not do this, her family's reputation would suffer. The young man also noted that he might even call off the engagement. Adila just smiled and said that she didn't care. After these words, Valero looked at the lady in surprise, because she didn't give a damn about her family. Adila even mentioned that she dreamed of her family disowning her. In fact, Adila and Valero were in the same situation. He was also despised by his own family. Because of this, Adila thought that they could create a family built on love and mutual respect. It was about the family that both young people did not have. But remembering the whole affair, the lady realized that her husband was cruel and did not care at all about his, if you can call it that, beloved. Constant beatings and bad treatment haunted Adila her whole life. First, she was abused by her own family, and then her husband joined in. Lady wanted with all her heart to immediately break all ties with Valero. The girl was so tired from flying on a broomstick that she lay down on the boy's bed. But he immediately showed her who was the boss in the house and asked her to get up immediately. Adila felt sad because instead of fencing, the guy was just sitting there doing nothing. And the fact of the rude conversation didn't please the girl at all. Valero said that his older brother was a swordsman and he himself had no talent for fencing. The impudent young man expected the girl to apologize for breaking into his apartment. Adila was tired of the meaningless chatter and quickly grabbed the sword that was lying in the room. The girl swung it and almost hit the young man. The boy turned pale and screamed at the top of his lungs. Adila suggested that they resolve their conflict with swords. The guy was seriously scared, because he wasn't strong enough in fencing. The ladies behaved so confidently that the guy didn't know what to do. Suddenly, Adila laughed and wondered if Duke Beck's son could defeat a common lady in a sword fight. The girl looked at the boy with a sneer and said that it would be a great shame. Valero, enraged, grabbed his sword. He confidently warned the lady that their fight could end badly. But suddenly, Adila laid her weapon on the ground. The girl grabbed his hand and sadly announced that she had pulled his shoulder. The young man also put down his weapon. An uncomfortable silence fell between the young people. Adila was about to attack the boy, but ended up getting hurt herself. The girl regretted making such an impulsive decision to visit the Beck estate. The girl preferred to be humiliated by the maids, not by the boy. After such humiliation, the lady did not want to leave the young man alive. Valero could not understand what nonsense Adila was talking about. The lady smiled and pointed out that there should be no witnesses to her disgrace. Nevertheless, Valero, either scared or determined to be magnanimous, still wrapped a bandage around Adila's hand and secured it with a bandage. The boy couldn't understand why the lady had taken up a sword if she didn't even know how to fight. In fact, Adila had come to break off her engagement to Valero. But looking at Valero, the girl remembered her past. If you remember, in the novel, the young man never began to heal the girl's wounds, and the reason why he became so unbearable was hidden deeper. Valero was a reflection of Adila's past, the part that gave in to hatred for all living things. Deep in thought, the girl was quite frightened by the boy's touch. He exclaimed at the unexpectedness of the lady. Valero finished with the bandage and asked the girl to go home. He promised that he would not tell his brother what he had seen Adila that day, but the boy asked him to remember that the only talent in their family was his older brother. Valero never wanted to hear about fencing again. It seemed that the boy's trauma had begun in his childhood. It was entirely his parents' fault. Adila looked intently at Valero and firmly stated that she would visit his estate every day until he taught her how to fence. The lady said that she had come to break off the engagement. But when Adila looked at the boy, she realized that if she simply broke off the engagement, it would not bring her any pleasure. The young man glared at the girl and was ready to defeat her in a sword duel. A scuffle broke out between the young people. They argued about fencing. The lady was ready to break off the engagement after the victory. Adila laughed and said that she couldn't date a guy who would lose to a weak girl. Valero was furious. He wasn't going to teach fencing to someone who was planning to defeat him. Adila wanted to learn the art of fencing and even offered to pay for the lessons. Valero was almost furious because he considered the lady too impudent. Meanwhile, at the Beck Manor, a conversation took place between two men. The topic was that a dark magician was hiding within the knightly order. Lord Beck, as the commander-in-chief, needed to do something about the magician. Former Commander-in-Chief Chris has become an ordinary man, and his strength is only a legend. Lord Beck has asked the man to drop by his dacha. An argument and even a fight broke out between the men. Chris believed that if the Lord was not going to help him, then he would cope on his own. The man was convinced that the top of the order had rotted after the arrival of Lord Beck. Lord Beck raised his head at Chris. He could not understand why the man dared to treat the current commander-in-chief of the Imperial Knights Order, Rodelvard, in this way. Chris turned and walked towards the exit. The man was upset because he could not understand what he had hoped for by going to the impudent. Chris realized with regret that without the support of the commander-in-chief, it would be difficult for him to conduct an investigation. As a distraught Chris walked down the hallway of the Beck mansion, a sword suddenly shattered a window and fell right at his feet. Meanwhile, Valero felt angry. The sword accidentally slipped from the lady's hands as she swung it. The boy shouted for the girl to hold the sword tighter. Valero couldn't understand how a normal person could throw a sword straight through the manor window. Meanwhile, Chris decided that someone was practicing somewhere nearby. The confused man looked out the open window and saw Duke Beck's youngest son. The man could not believe his eyes, because he had heard from gossip that the young man had given up fencing and vowed never to pick up a sword again. Looking closer, Chris realized that it was indeed Valero. The man wondered what kind of lady he had been training. But Chris was more interested in how the girl had managed to get the stubborn young man to take up the sword again. As Chris did not look closely, he realized that he was unfamiliar with the beauty. It occurred to the man that the lady was clearly from a noble family. It was interesting what she was doing at Beck's estate. Since Valero had no friends, the fact that he was fighting with a girl alarmed him. The man was more likely to believe the world was ending than that the young man had become friends with someone. As the former commander-in-chief of the Order of Imperial Knights, Chris was obliged to learn as much as possible about the incident he had witnessed. Meanwhile, Valero tried to explain to the girl that she must hold the sword firmly in her hands, otherwise she could get injured again. As it turned out, Adila was even more hopeless than the young man had imagined. Adila was convinced that she was a natural fencer. In her mind, these movements were perfect. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she walked away, frowning. In her past life, the girl should have spent her time studying dark magic, not fencing. Adila was so upset that she didn't notice when she crashed into someone. Chris immediately told the girl that he was about to leave the estate, but a sword fell at his feet. The man noted that the lady had thrown the sword out the window in the company of the second son of Duke Beck. The man held out his sword and gave it to the lady. The girl thanked him. Suddenly, Adila recognized the man. She remembered that he was the former commander-in-chief of the Imperial Knights. Chris didn't feature much in the novel, but the girl remembered him from the pictures. Valero, looking at the man, asked if he had met Rode's brother. Chris smiled and said he had exchanged a few words with Rode. Valero mentioned that Chris had also been accused of violent acts against ordinary people. Chris even blackmailed his subordinates. For such actions, the man was expelled in disgrace. Valero was furious. He gripped his sword tightly and attacked Chris. Valero seemed to be furious. He could not understand how the man dared to show himself to Rode. But Chris was not one of the timid. He grabbed with both fingers and squeezed in his hands the tip of the sword that the young man swung at him. The man thought it was impolite to attack someone with false accusations. The young men froze as Chris stopped the sword with his fingers. Chris explained that he was an ordinary man and that the nobles had accused him of various sins. The man said that Rode himself had offered him a deal. The deal was that either Chris would be killed to silence him or he would resign from the order himself. So the man didn't really have a choice. Unfortunately, Chris was later not only accused of many false things, but also had to quit his beloved job. Valero only smiled at his husband's story and praised him for his excellent sword skills. Adila watched the situation in surprise. Valero first showered Chris with accusations and then decided to praise him. In general, the lady knew little about Chris. In the novel, Adila never met him, and this was not surprising, because according to the plot of the story, the girl joined forces with dark magicians who wanted to seize power in the country. For various acts, Adila was sentenced to death. An organization of dark magicians began to manipulate the disappointed Adila and use her as a pawn. No one understood why the girl succumbed to evil. It turned out that Chris, like Adila, had been innocently accused and everything had been taken away. Suddenly, it occurred to the girl that maybe the man wasn't as bad as everyone said he was. Chris approached the lady and politely asked who she was for Duke Beck's second son. Valero clenched his fists and muttered angrily that Adila was his bride. The angry young man also ordered Chris to take his hands off the lady. Nevertheless, Adila smiled and politely introduced herself to the man. When Chris heard the name Ravel, he let out a surprised cry of delight. It turned out that the beautiful girl was a descendant of the great magician. Chris had many questions. He wanted to know why a girl from such a noble family was going to marry such a wretch. Chris pointed out that Valero didn't like people and didn't know anything. Displeased, Valero asked Chris to shut up. Suddenly, Rode approached the young men. The man became curious about what was happening. According to Rode, he came out of his office and noticed that someone had broken a window. In the process of searching for the culprit, the man noticed the rude person who had hit him on the leg and his incompetent younger brother. It also occurred to Rode that the lady who was next to the men was the bride of his talentless brother. Adila realized that because of that man, Valero was destined to become a terrible tyrant in the future. The commander-in-chief of the Order of the Imperial Knights and Valero's older brother is Rodelvard Beck. Rode asked if anyone was hurt. Since someone had broken a window on the second floor, the man thought someone was doing something dangerous. Valero pointed his finger at Adila and pointed out that she was the one who broke the window with her sword. A few seconds later, the three men were looking at the girl with displeasure. In desperation, Adila apologized. She admitted that she had indeed broken the window by accident. The lady was ready to accept any punishment. Rode had no intention of ordering anyone. He asked the lady to keep her head up and not worry. The man understood the situation, because everyone could have some setbacks. Adila was pleasantly surprised by Rode's behavior. It even occurred to the lady that she had been deeply mistaken about Valero's older brother. Rode smiled and noted that this incident only proved that the girl simply had no talent for fencing. He also added that Adila was just like Valero. Adila was upset because she believed that the man was not so bad, but she was wrong. Moreover, Rode began to blame his brother for taking up the sword again. Rode assured his brother that he shouldn't listen to what others say, even if it was the boy's fiancée. The man continued to explain to Valero that he was a poor swordsman. Adila could not calmly look at the situation that had developed. She stood up and began to loudly ask her husband why he was telling his brother how to live. But Rode just waved his hand, believing that he knew his brother better than anyone else. Adila began to argue with her husband, arguing that he was to blame for all of Valero's troubles. Adila assured Rode that Valero would never pass by a wounded person, no matter how he felt about them. Rode, in turn, said that every time his brother saw a stray cat, he pretended not to be interested in it. But after a few minutes, he would bring it food and try to pet it. Adila noted that Valero liked beautiful things, and Rode shouted that when the young man ate, he always started eating vegetables, not meat. Rode tried his best to convey to Adila that he knew his brother very well. The quarrel between the young people continued. Rode knew how hard his brother had worked, and he saw that he had no talent for fencing. The man was convinced that if Valero continued in the same vein, he would eventually be defeated by his own weaknesses. Chris intervened in the conversation. He explained that it was simply impossible to convince the stubborn Rode. Although the man seemed cold from the outside, he was very attentive to people, especially to his younger brother. Rode was quite attentive, but for some reason, he couldn't find the dark mage who was hiding. The man was stubborn, and he got tired of telling Chris that it was his personal business. Adila listened with interest to the conversation, as it was about a dark magician. Suddenly, Rode turned to the lady and asked her to listen to him carefully. The man had no idea what the daughter of the Ravel family had said to Valero, but he certainly knew him better than the girl. Rode looked sternly at the lady and pleaded with her not to annoy the young man with her talk. Rode frowned and stepped forward, calling Valero with him. Chris, who had been observing the situation, thought that someone had been developing a brother complex all their life. Adila's only hope was in Chris. The girl decided to find out if the dark magician was really hiding in the knightly order. The man kindly explained that it was an old story, from when he was still the commander-in-chief of the order. Then Chris noticed a suspicious guy talking to one of the knights in the hallway. Of course, the man cut him off. Chris did such a rash act in a state of high spirits. As it turned out, the soldier received money from that strange young man, a bribe to put it mildly. In the order, of course, such things were forbidden. Nevertheless, the fact was not uncommon. Then Chris thought that he would simply beat them and find out what they were both doing, but the guys disappeared. Chris had the impression that he had been alone in the corridor the whole time. People were disappearing without a trace. It was definitely one of the dark spells. Only dark magicians possessed teleportation spells. Adila knew this for sure, because in the novel, the lady used the same magic when she contacted the dark magicians. Suddenly, Chris became thoughtful. The man noticed that Adila had become deeply thoughtful as soon as he spoke about dark magic. The man even thought that the girl knew something. "You're less than me," Chris decided to tell me that in fact, the dark magician infiltrated the order, not only because of this incident, but as Rode said, it was better for outsiders not to interfere in the matter. Chris had already told the unfamiliar lady a lot of information and thought it was time to stop. But Adila seemed to be fired up. She asked her husband to continue the story and promised that she wouldn't tell anyone. Adila didn't even try to hide her curiosity. Still, the man didn't believe much that the lady was somehow connected to dark magicians. The man was convinced that the girl was more concerned about her relationship with that little braggart than the problems of the empire. Suddenly, Chris realized that this was his chance. It occurred to Chris that if he could get Adila involved, he would get the support from the nobility that he needed for his investigation. Considering that Adila was the daughter of the Ravel family of magicians, catching a dark magician with her participation would have been much easier. Chris had a cunning plan. He was embarrassed to ask for something like this, but the man admitted that he had no one he could rely on. The man looked intently at Adila and asked her to help him catch the criminal and save the empire from evil. The lady was happy to help. Chris intended to take advantage of Adila's status and power. Meanwhile, Valero was talking to his older brother. The subject turned to Adila. The lady was rather silent, although in reality, it turned out that she was not as calm as she seemed at first glance. Valero looked at his brother indignantly, because Mr. Chris had told him and Adila that he had resigned at his request. Rode believed that such a delicate topic was not at all his brother's concern, for he was convinced that none of the above should concern Valero. The man was ready to deal with everything himself. All Rode expected of his brother was for him to be an obedient boy. Valero just lowered his gaze and remained silent. In the morning, a servant knocked on Valero's room and said he had brought breakfast. But the angry young man wanted nothing and ordered him not to be disturbed. The young man was in no mood at all. He angrily recalled the words of his older brother, who constantly humiliated and underestimated him. An angry Valero wanted to throw the book against the wall. But suddenly, Adila caught his hand. The girl pointed out that throwing things was a pretty bad habit. Valero was seriously frightened, not knowing that there was anyone else in the room besides himself. It had only been 2 weeks since the lady's last visit to the estate. The young man could not understand what exactly Adila wanted from him. The lady reminded the young man of their planned duel. She was ready to come every day until he defeated Valero. Since the girl had been missing for 2 weeks, Valero had already forgotten about his promise. The lady was innocent, as Rode had forbidden her to appear in the duchy. No one wanted to let Adila into the estate, and this led her to believe that Mr. Rode was involved. The girl thought that the man had told all the guards what a troublemaker she was. Adila was proud of herself, having spent 2 whole weeks mastering the magic of flying on a broomstick. Valero looked at the lady in surprise and realized that she had entered the duchy illegally with the help of magic. The young man wasn't even surprised by this event, but he wondered, because Adila was able to master the magic of flight in just 2 weeks. These were phenomenally fast results. From the very beginning, it was not easy for Adila. It was especially difficult to balance while sitting on a broom, although she gradually got the hang of it. Instead of being happy for the lady, Valero became angry. He angrily exclaimed that this was the difference between them. The young man believed that the girl would never be able to understand what it was like to be talentless. Adila was born talented, and magic came to her surprisingly easily. She even started fencing for fun. Suddenly, it occurred to the young man that Adila had arranged everything on purpose. For some reason, Valero thought that Adila had taken up fencing simply to make fun of what a poor swordsman he was. But that was completely untrue. In fact, the girl had taken up the sword to defeat the boy. Adila admitted that she had gone on such an adventure in order to ridicule in a fair duel how talentless her fiancé was and how much stronger she was than him. The young man noticed that the girl began to move much faster than during their joint classes. Adila said that, in fact, she had also been fencing with Mr. Chris for the entire 2 weeks. The girl had wounds on her face, and the boy realized that it was from training. It turned out that the lady had asked Chris to teach her fencing so that she could fight Valero in a fair duel. The girl also intended to clear Mr. Chris's good name. To do this, Adila had to join the Order of the Imperial Knights. Valero considered Adila completely insane. The girl believed that the boy also knew deep down that Mr. Chris was innocent. A dark mage was hiding in the order, and Adila wanted Valero to help her catch him. But the young man refused. He couldn't understand why he would help anyone. Valero also didn't want to anger his brother even more. Since this was a rather dangerous matter, Adila didn't want to force the young man into anything. The lady got on a broom and flew out the window. The young man chased after her and shouted at the girl not to come back. But Adila did not want to give up. She assured him that she would keep her promise and would continue to bother the boy for a long time. Even the fact that the guy might try to put a magical barrier on the room didn't scare the lady, and she was ready to get him out of the ground. In fact, Valero found Adila amazing and even admired her. She was excellent at magic and even took up the sword, although she was constantly injured. Suddenly, the young man found himself thinking that he was very worried about the girl. Meanwhile, Adila regretted that she had never managed to persuade Valero. The guy had nothing to do with dark magicians in the novel, so it occurred to the lady that perhaps it was for the best. The girl noticed that although she and Valero had not seen each other for a long time, the guy looked terrible. When Adila flew into her room and was expressing her thoughts out loud, she was interrupted by Sharon, who for some unknown reason was sitting in the girl's room. The brother, looking at his sister, could not believe that at such an age she would be interested in communicating with boys. The man had already managed to find out that Adila had been in the Duchy of Beck all this time. Since Adila was visiting the duchy quite often, Lord Beck complained to her parents about it. In fact, the whole family was convinced that the girl would really want to break off her engagement to the Duke. Sharon was sure that her father would be happy to learn that everything was mutual and wonderful between Valero and Adila. Lady did not want to listen to her brother's chatter at all. The girl nervously asked what Sharon had left in her room. The guy had come to his sister for a reason. He had one thing on his mind, and he wanted to discuss it with his sister. For a moment, the lady held her breath. She had thoughts that her brother had learned something he shouldn't have. The girl's biggest fear was that Sharon had overheard the information about reincarnation. Adila was also concerned that her brother seemed too serious. The lady wanted to know as soon as possible what the conversation was about, but she had a bad feeling. Sharon suddenly declared that her sister needed to see a doctor. The lady's strange behavior was the basis for this thought. First, Adila attacked the maid, and then flew on a broomstick to Beck County, destroying the groom's room. Adila was behaving quite strangely. No one had ever noticed the girl being so aggressive and defiant before. Despite the fact that her father turned a blind eye to her daughter's behavior, Sharon was convinced that something was wrong with Adila. Sharon, of course, was glad that Adila had become more honest with others and with herself, but her aggressive behavior was a little frightening. Sharon was ready to personally arrange an appointment with the best doctor. His brother assured his sister that it wouldn't take long. Adila just laughed and said that she felt great. The girl realized that she really wasn't behaving like Adila. It even occurred to her to behave more modestly and restrainedly. Adila tried to convince her brother Hat she was completely healthy. Sharon just took a deep breath as a bandaged girl stood before him, looking like a mummy. Sharon had no idea what Adila was doing because she was all injured. The girl didn't want her brother to poke his nose into other people's business. It occurred to the man that his sister was going to join the Order of Knights to clear the good name of the former commander-in-chief. The man guessed Adila's intentions, and that fact worried her. It was just Sharon's assumption, but it turned out to be correct. Sharon had no idea that the lady's plans would be so obvious. Her brother noticed that her sister had suddenly taken up fencing. This could be understood by looking at her calloused hands and battered appearance. There was also an incident in Beck County. Rumor had it that the former commander-in-chief of the force was there. Sharon was convinced that it was he who had become Adila's fencing teacher. It was obvious that a man wouldn't do such work for free, and the girl wouldn't take money from her father. So Sharon easily guessed that Chris had offered Adila a deal. It seemed that Sharon was a born detective, but the lady began to refute her husband's opinion, claiming that everything was completely different. Adila became very suspicious that her brother was following her. Also strange was the fact that Sharon even knew that Mr. Chris had been falsely accused. But it was obvious, since there were rumors that he was not guilty, but that the higher members of the order were to blame for everything. Sharon smiled displeasedly and noted that Adila didn't really know anything about this world. Mr. Chris loved his job and gave his all to the service. Everyone in the order respected him. But someone started dirty gossip, and the man was thoughtlessly accused. Sharon believed that he was on a completely different level compared to his sister. The man also confirmed the fact that, if you believe the gossip, something was wrong in the order. Curiosity gripped his brother. He wanted to know what the girl was going to do in the knightly order. Adila didn't know how to act, and whether she could tell her brother about the dark magician. In fact, Adila had no evidence. Mr. Chris could also have just imagined everything. The cunning Sharon suggested that his sister arrange a sword duel. If he won, the man wanted Adila to tell him everything. Events happened too quickly. In a matter of seconds, the man thrust a sword into his sister and immediately started a fight. With the first blow, Adila flew into the wall. The girl was in pain. Fencing had always been Sharon's weak point, but defeating her sister turned out to be easier than he thought. Confused, Adila looked at her brother. It occurred to the girl that Sharon simply wanted to kill her. But the man said that he had simply begun to take his sister seriously. Since Adila had shown everyone her true powers, the man was not going to give her any concessions. Since Sharon had won the duel, he demanded that Adila tell him the whole truth. Sharon also threatened her sister that if she tried to lie, he would tell her father. The girl laughed nervously and realized that she had no choice. Adila had nothing left to say, and decided to tell them that she had to infiltrate the order in order to find the dark mage. The girl was convinced that Duke Beck's eldest son was hiding something. Mr. Chris said that he and the current commander-in-chief had made a deal, and that was why he was able to leave unharmed. Besides, Mr. Rode didn't really like Adila. He was the one who was to blame for Valero's changes. Sharon wasn't sure his sister could handle it. He wanted Adila to understand him correctly. It wasn't that the man didn't believe in her and Chris's success. He also wanted to do his own investigation into the knighthood. After listening to her brother, Adila suggested that they work together. She was sure that under such circumstances, they would succeed. In the Empire, a selection round was held once a year. Those who were able to pass it could join the knightly order as a cadet, regardless of their origin. Sharon suggested that one young man should pass this selection, regardless of whether people believed in his abilities or not. Persistence would bring the young man impressive results. Chris planned to spend a lot of energy to turn Adila into a real monster, although the man understood that he would have to kill a lot of his free time. For the first time, one of the young fencers was to make a huge splash at a qualifying tournament and compete against a nobleman. People would expect to see a bully, but it turned out to be an ordinary young man named Dia. Adila had to get into the order by any means, but for that she had to work hard. Of course, a girl would hardly be considered, so Chris intended to pass off the lady as a boy. Chris was convinced that he had come up with a cunning plan because Adila would not have been able to infiltrate the Order in any other way. Since their enemy was entrenched within the Order, the best option to track him was to blend in with the people. According to Chris's plan, the girl was to infiltrate the Order as a young swordsman and grab the magician by the tail. The man planned to make the lady a real man. Since the girl was still a teenager, disguising her as a boy was no problem. Time was very short as the qualifying round was soon to take place. Adila was upset because there was absolutely no time left, and she did not have any decent skills. The man looked at the lady intently and assured her that he was the former commander-in-chief of the Imperial Knights and would teach her everything he knew. Besides, in the qualifying round, the girl's main task was to defeat her opponent, and it didn't matter how. The lady became a little timid. Mr. Chris turned out to be a scary person. Soon, Adila's style was completely changed. The girl's hair was cut short, and she became like a young man. In small steps, she became a spy. All that remained was to follow the important people of the Order and find the dark magician. After a short time, Adila, who became Dio, turned out to be a good guy. She even found a friend, Ray, who was ready to tell her everything and show her. Suddenly, Ray, looking closely at Dio, remarked that he was incredibly handsome. Adila breathed a sigh of relief, because for a moment it seemed to her that she had been exposed. Dia's new friend was happy to have a new member on their team. The guy also introduced Dia to other members of the Order. The cadets declared that their commander-in-chief valued only lineage, not fighting ability. They believed that if a young man was not of noble birth, he was simply dust underfoot. Dio witnessed a fight between young men of different ranks. The young man believed that it did not matter whether a person was a commoner or an aristocrat, as they had all gathered to defend the empire. Suddenly, Ray looked at Dio intently. The young man thought that his new friend reminded him of someone. Thinking about it, it seemed to him that Dio resembled the former commander-in-chief, Mr. Chris. Ray said that even though Chris was released with many charges against him, the guy knew for sure that he had good intentions. Chris always treated everyone on the same level and did not distinguish between ordinary people and aristocrats. Ray remembered how Mr. Chris had fought Lord Rodelvard. He had moved so fast that it was hard to follow his movements. The young man remembered that battle forever. Adila realized that Chris was quite popular among the cadets. Although the lady did not see the best side of the man, he did not seem bad to her at all. Adila wanted to find out if all of Chris's accusations were false. Chris asked Adila to steal documents from Rhodes' office, but the man could not even think that the girl would succeed. Chris was also interested in whether the lady had learned anything about the dark magician. There was no news about this. Suddenly, Chris looked at the lady with interest and asked why she had decided to team up with him. Chris had been thinking about this for a long time. The girl's behavior immediately seemed interesting to the man, because she didn't know if he was lying to her about the dark magician or not, but she still believed him. Adila also did not know whether all the accusations that were made against Chris were true or false. Despite the fact that the lady did not have accurate information, she simply agreed to cooperate with her husband. Chris thought Adila was hiding something. Since the young people were already partners, the man wanted to know the whole truth. Chris got too close to Adila, but she pushed him away. The young people had never had such a close relationship, and she didn't want something like that to happen again. Of course, Adila hid the fact that she knew the entire plot of the novel, and that's why she wanted to influence him. But the lady couldn't possibly tell Chris about it. It would be strange to tell the man that Adila had moved from another world to this one, and that they were all just characters in a novel. Chris, by the way, was supposed to die at the end. If Adila had confessed everything, she would have been considered crazy. Therefore, the lady had no choice but to hide the information. Chris still couldn't understand why Adila would agree to take on such a risky venture without any personal gain. It was a mystery to him. Lady said that the Ravel family knew from the beginning that Chris had been falsely accused. That's why Adila's parents wanted to investigate the case themselves. In fact, the girl had stolen the reason of her older brother. Such words seemed at least plausible. It seemed that Chris believed Adila. As soon as Chris was appointed commander-in-chief, He was lucky enough to meet Count Ravel. The Count didn't care about Chris's background. All that mattered to him was the result. Since Chris had risen to such a high rank, Count Ravel was confident that the man would be able to protect their empire. In Chris's opinion, the Count turned out to be a tough man and much smarter than the other aristocrats. Unlike the nobles, Chris was an ordinary man who had lost everything. The man had lost his beloved job, the support of the nobility, and even the respect of the people. After listening to the whole story, Adila said that she herself did not know why she signed up for such a dangerous adventure. Adila herself wanted to understand who the magician who had infiltrated the order really was. Adila also admitted that she hated her family. If the lady had even taken up dark magic, her relatives would not have said anything at all. Adila simply wanted to be different from her family. Chris still waited for the lady to tell him the reason why she agreed to help him. The lady smiled and looked at Chris intently. Then she said that she could not refuse her friend's help. Chris's eyes widened in surprise. The lady had just called the simpleton her friend. The man gently hinted to Adila that not all acquaintances should be called friends. Chris considered Adila more of a partner than a friend, but he was still pleased to hear such words. So he gave the girl a friendly hug. Unfortunately, Chris and Adila never met in the novel, but the girl was happy that she was able to travel with him. The next morning, in the guise of Dia, the lady was carrying a huge stack of documents. No one had noticed the loss of so many documents yet. It seemed that the lady had resigned herself to the fact that she committed such a crime every day. Adila considered herself a good spy, as she had never been caught before. Walking calmly down the corridor, the girl heard voices. She hid in an instant. Rode told the cadets that the daughter of the Mizinst family was a difficult person. The man warned that the lady was not worth angering again. Mr. Rodelvard looked surprisingly calm as he handed out the assignments. The two cadets were assigned to accompany the daughter of the Mizinst family, while the commander-in-chief dealt with her father. One of the cadets started talking about the new recruit Dio. The surprise made the lady lean against the wall, but the Lord proudly noted that he was not interested in such information. During the conversation, one of the cadets mentioned Chris. It seemed to Adila that there had once been an unresolved conflict between Mr. Chris and Mr. Rodelvard, so it was not possible to talk about it. Lord Rode was a character about whom little was written in the novel, but the man made a bad impression upon first meeting him. The Lord, of course, took care of Valero, but this only made the young man worse. Also, for some unknown reason, the Lord hated Mr. Chris. But it was Lord Rode who forced Chris to leave, saving his life. Suddenly, Adila shuddered. It occurred to the girl that the Lord himself might be somehow connected with the dark magicians. The lady intended to clarify her assumptions. As the carriage with the cadets was preparing to leave, the lady quietly jumped into the luggage compartment. The girl had to get to one place. Meanwhile, Duke Ravel was talking to his son, Sharon. The father noted that he had not seen Adila at all lately. The man seemed worried. Sharon said that Adila became interested in fencing, and he rented her a cabin deep in the mountains. He also hired a teacher so that she could practice in peace. Still, the Duke was worried about who would take care of his daughter in the mountains. The girl even left without saying anything. Sharon assured her father that Adila was already quite independent for her age and asked him not to worry. In fact, Sharon had to lie to her father at the request of her younger sister. The husband knew that Adila would have to live in the order during the operation. She asked Sharon to cover for her from her father. Adila began to act like a different person. Sharon believed that the magic in the girl's body, due to her transitioning age, began to affect her behavior. Sharon even began to worry about her sister and thought she might have a personality disorder. It was also unknown where the girl's interest in investigating the dark magician case came from. Sharona was filled with curiosity. It was time to find out all the secrets that Adila was hiding. As the girl's older brother, the man intended to figure everything out. Sharon got up from the table and strode to her sister's room. The father went after his son. The Duke warned the man that one should not enter the young people's room without their permission. Disobeying his father, Sharon nevertheless entered his sister's room. The man saw a notebook on the table. He thought it was Adila's diary. The dissatisfied Duke put his hands on his hips and pointed out that it was rude to rummage through other people's personal belongings. even if they were his younger sister's belongings. When Sharon opened the notebook, she was almost speechless. The diary entries were written in Japanese. It was in this notebook that the lady described her enemies, everything about them, and who would kill whom when. Fortunately, neither Sharon nor her father could figure out what language it was. The man had read many books in many languages in his life, but he had never seen writing like this. For some unknown reason, Sharon took Adila's diary. The Duke didn't like it, but the man wanted to conduct some investigation. Meanwhile, Dia continued to travel in the baggage compartment. The carriage arrived at Mrs. Miesenst's. The girl was very difficult and had a difficult and defiant character. The men quickly got out of the carriage and introduced themselves as knights of the Imperial Order. That day, the knights were to accompany the lady. But the girl turned out to be not as simple as everyone thought. The lady was almost speechless and looked dissatisfied with everything. After listening to the men, she realized that she would be accompanied by ordinary people. The lady would rather die than breathe the same air with the servants. Jonah thought it was better to drink from a dirty puddle than to be around the people who were in front of her. The girl gathered her thoughts and immediately told who should behave and how. The knights, after listening to the long lectures, bowed to Yomi and were happy to serve her. Meanwhile, Dia, who continued to sit in the luggage compartment, had no idea where he had ended up, but the impudent girl was already starting to make him nervous. Dia quickly got her bearings and realized that the knight's task was to escort a lady named Jonah. The girl rummaged through her thoughts and remembered that that girl was in the novel. Her psyche turned out to be the most broken of all. Finally, Dia remembered that dress and hairstyle. There was an arc in the novel where Adila's rival appeared. It was her, Lady Yoma. Finally, the knight managed to persuade him to sit in the carriage with them. The men breathed a sigh of relief because they finally stopped listening to the lady's loud and meaningless chatter. Dia could not have imagined that he would meet the same psychic so soon. Still, the young man could not understand why the order was tasked with escorting such a significant figure. Dia noticed that the knights had drawn their daggers and were happy to be allowed to get rid of the voracious infection. The young man could not control himself and jumped out of the luggage compartment. Dia, sticking his head forward, suggested that the young men live together. The knights began to shout. No one expected that someone would jump out from behind them so instantly. From such loud cries, Dia himself began to scream. The young man regretted that he had shown himself at all. When everyone calmed down, a conversation broke out between the boys. The knights wanted to know where Dia had come from in the cart. The young man admitted that he had been sitting there the whole time. The men were shocked to learn that the boy had heard their entire conversation. Since the conversation was so heated, no one was watching the road. As a result, the cart crashed into a tree. Lady Minzest was stunned by this accident. The girl jumped out of her carriage in an instant. She caused a real scandal among the knights. The already confused men didn't even have the strength to listen to the screams and noise. They silently lowered their heads and wished that Yoma would shut his mouth as soon as possible. The knight's plan failed. One of the men realized that the young man was in a cadet uniform and recognized him as the legendary new guy. The knight laughed, for he and Dia were not enemies at all. It turned out that both the knights and the cadet were of ordinary origin. The men were followers of the former commander-in-chief. The guys were like friends with Chris, as they shared various information with each other. However, after a little thought, the knights decided to finish off the guy. The men told the recruit that the knife they were holding was a bomb. One of the knights threw the knife up. Dia, surprised, rushed to Yoma and hugged him. Dia screamed in horror that they were going to kill him and Yoma. Adila realized that it was the end for her. She didn't want to die in the middle of the novel, because she hadn't yet had time to meet her love and build a family. Adila wanted so much to buy herself beautiful dresses with her family's money and to visit the best pastry shops. A lady's life could be fun, and she regretted that she had gotten into something she shouldn't have. Suddenly, the girl opened her eyes and saw Valero in front of her. Adila was all bandaged up. She didn't expect such a turn of events, so when she saw the guy, she just jumped out of bed. The lady had no idea where she was or what Valero was doing next to her. The young man gently hugged the lady and asked where she had gotten herself into. Valero was going to explain everything, but first asked the girl to lie back down in bed. The lady was at the Beck family's country estate. The young man explained that Adila had been unconscious for over a week. Suddenly, the girl remembered recent events. The knights had a bomb and wanted to kill Lady Yoma. Valero asked Adila to calm down and not to be nervous. The girl immediately jumped up and panicked. She hoped that Lady Yoma was still alive. Lady Minzest was at that time outside the door of the room where Valero and Dio were. Hearing the voices of the young men, the young lady was glad that Dio had come to his senses. Meanwhile, Adila also heard Lady Yoma's voice. Valero instantly grabbed the wig and ordered the girl to quickly put it on. The young man also handed Adila a uniform. The girl did not understand why she should disguise herself. Valero reminded the lady that she was a young man. Worried, Adila quickly began to change clothes. A few minutes later, a frightened Lady Yoma ran to Dio and hugged him tightly. The young man was unconscious for a long time, and the lady decided that she would never be able to talk to him again. Dio didn't want the lady to worry so much about him and reminded her that she hated ordinary people. But unfortunately for Lady Minzest, there were no barriers when it came to love. Sir Dio risked his life as a plebeian to save him. When the young man covered the lady with his body, she realized she had fallen in love. Valero's eyes began to twitch as he listened to the lady's story. Adila realized that she had been tricked. Thanks to her magic, she was able to save herself and him from the knights. Adila has no memory of anything, but at the moment of the explosion, she created a huge barrier that protected her and Yoma from the blast. Immediately after that event, Dio fell and lost consciousness. Lady Minzest wept over the cold body of the young man. Suddenly, by great luck, Sir Valero's carriage passed by, and he saved the young people. In fact, Adila did not remember using magic. Valero hinted that Adila was on the verge of death. The man also added that mages could use nonverbal magic when they were in danger. Since Adila had put up a barrier and no one was hit by the explosion, she was surprised how there were so many wounds on her body. Jonah reminded her that because of the two bastards, they had gotten into an accident and the carriage had crashed. Due to the accident and the use of magic, the girl's body became weak, and for that reason, she lost consciousness for a whole week. Adila inquired about the fate of the two knights who had been the attackers. She thought the men had also been affected by the explosion. But to the lady's great surprise, the men had disappeared. As soon as the dust from the explosion cleared, neither the wagon nor the men themselves were visible. It seemed as if nothing had happened. Only Yoma and Sir Dio remained in the clearing. Valero felt sad and said that Lady Minzest did not want to leave his estate until Sir Dio regained consciousness. The daughter of the Minzest family was famous for her terrible attitude towards ordinary people, but she still managed to befriend Sir Dio. The situation was extremely strange and suspicious. The knights who attacked the young men disappeared without a trace, just like in Mr. Chris's story. Only dark magicians could perform such tricks. Lady Adila jumped up with joy because she had managed to find those same dark magicians. She wanted to tell everything to Mr. Chris immediately, but Valero asked the girl to come to her senses and be silent for at least a second. Valero could not understand the girl's meaningless conversation because she was on the verge of death. But everything was not so simple. The dark magician was in the order and knew Adila by sight. Valero believed that it was worth nothing for the dark magician to get rid of such a weakling as Adila. The girl almost died when she met the black magician's executioners. The young man believed that the lady was not capable of standing up for herself. Adila was outraged because she survived and even protected Lady Yoma. But not everything was so clear-cut. The girl was simply lucky, because if it weren't for Yoma, Valero would never have picked up both girls, because he wouldn't have even noticed them. The girl did not understand the boy's train of thought. Valero, angry, explained that if the knights had not fled, they would have killed both her and Lady Hema. A quarrel broke out between the young people. Each argued his point of view. Nevertheless, Valero admitted that he was worried about Adila. Suddenly, the lady looked into the young man's eyes. They looked red and tired. The girl wondered when the young man had last slept. Adila was right. Valero barely closed his eyes and waited for the lady to come to her senses. Valero felt embarrassed and tried to refute Adila's words. The young man said that he simply had not slept the last few nights. Adila decided to sleep in. as she had to return to the order the next day. The girl promised to visit Valero every day. After joining the order, Adila did not stop visiting Valero. Every day she told the young man her news. Since Adila worked for the order, Valero could not understand how she managed to escape from her duties to come to his home. The girl laughed. It was not for nothing that she learned to fly on a broomstick. Adila ran away during lunch breaks. The lady also told Valero that her fencing skills were growing every day. The lady believed that she had joined the order for a reason. She was ready to defeat the young man soon. Adila planned to definitely become a sword master and the coolest fencer in a month. Suddenly, Valero felt a little uneasy. The young man was afraid that Adila would really defeat him. The girl's goal was to break off her engagement to the young man. The young man was afraid that if the girl defeated him, she would break off relations with him without regret. The young man was afraid of being left all alone. The commander-in-chief of the order gave free fencing lessons to children in the poor areas of the city, and Valero wanted to learn from him. Valero told the butler this information. The man was proud that the young man was going to take up the sword again. The young man asked the man not to tell his brother about his plans. Valero assured the servant that he was not going there to study, but to mock the former commander-in-chief, who had begun teaching some children. The next morning, Valero was already at Adila's side. The lady had already fully recovered, and the young man was proud that he had not wasted his money on high-quality potions. The Order of Knights was closely connected to the alchemical tower. They produced healing potions that would instantly put any wounded soldier back on his feet. To buy one bottle of Valero's potion, she had to give away all her pocket money. Adila was amazed by the guy's generosity and thanked him sincerely. But the boy had become somewhat unfriendly. He asked the lady if it was unpleasant to be in debt to someone you hated. Adila did not immediately understand what he was talking about. She had never told Valero that she hated him. The girl laughed, thinking the young man strange. The fact that she came to see him every day meant that she was not indifferent to him. After such words, Valero walked around dreamily all day. When it was time for dinner, the butler could barely call out to the young gentleman as he was flying in the clouds. The servant even wanted to bring a first aid kit because something was wrong with the boy. The maids noticed that Mr. Valero had been acting so strangely since he returned from the country estate. The women thought that the young man had finally fallen in love. Since everyone around him considered Valero to be a sociopath, the suggestion that he had fallen in love seemed very strange to the women. The young man heard everything and ordered the servants to get out of his sight. Valero believed that all the problems were because of Adila. Not only did she get into various situations, but she also stated that she did not hate him. In fact, Valero was quite fixated on Adila's words. Locked in his room, the young man talked to himself. He exclaimed that the girl was an idiot and that he didn't care about her or her words. Rode overheard his brother's conversation, and then he dared to go in. The man asked if Valero was all right. Since all the servants had run out of the young man's room, it occurred to Rode that they had angered him in some way. Rode asked Valero to come with him, as his father wanted to have dinner with them both. A few minutes later, the young people were already sitting at the dinner table. The father was happy to see his sons. Rode, as always, was polite and talkative. Valero, on the contrary, was thoughtful and silent. That day, the father had intended to speak specifically to Valero. The man had expressed the opinion that he was planning to break off his engagement to the daughter of the Ravel family. There were rumors that Adila had become very cruel to people. She had beaten her maid and run away from home. It was said that the lady had even made her stepmother faint. The father also complained to his sons that the girl had broken windows in their duchy. From the very beginning, the engagement was planned in order to take control of the Ravel family, but their daughter was going to renounce her family. Mr. Beck saw no point in getting involved with such a girl again. Moreover, the man had already invited a new candidate for the role of Valero's bride to the estate. The boy didn't like his father's idea at all. In fact, he had already become attached to Adila and liked her. Although the young man refused to admit it to himself, Valero stood up abruptly and said that he didn't like it at all that his father decided everything for him. The young man tried to tell his father that he knew absolutely nothing about the girl. Mr. Beck had never actually seen Adila, but had simply believed the gossip. Rode was quite surprised that his brother would defend someone like that. It was the first time. The father thought about his son's words. He approached him, smiled, and admitted that he was surprised. Valero had not shared his thoughts with his father for a long time. But Mr. Beck would not tolerate any objections, even from his son. In a fit of anger, the man slapped Valero quite hard in the face. Mr. Beck considered Valero a disgrace to their family. All that was required of the young man was that he should marry well. Rode sided with his brother. He asked his father to forgive the young man, calling him a hot-tempered boy. Angry at the whole world, Valero didn't want anyone to touch him, not even Rode. The father abruptly shifted his gaze to his eldest son and asked how he was doing in the order. Everything was fine with Rode. In his place, at first, there was a commoner, that is, Chris. The father was quite surprised that his son let the man leave the order alive. Chris had no connections or wealth. All he had was respect among the other knights. The father looked at his son intently and noted that he should not fall face down and lose to an ordinary simpleton. Soon, Adila met with Chris. The man praised the lady for having coped with the task. The girl found 2 subordinates of the dark magician. She was also a witness among the nobles. Chris considered it a success in such a short time. The man reminded the girl that this investigation was secret. Since Adila had given herself away, the dark magician could begin to act very carefully. Chris was very worried about the girl's condition. He kept asking if she was okay. A bomb had been thrown at the young people, and they had miraculously survived. Adila said that Valero took care of her, and she was completely back on her feet. Hearing the young man's name, Chris was almost speechless. The lady assured her husband that she and Valero had hidden themselves in a country estate, and that no one had seen them. Still, Chris was concerned and pointed out that Rode must not know about their meetings. Chris was convinced that Rode was definitely connected to those soldiers, since he had instructed them to escort Baron Meisenst's daughter. But the lady remembered how the knights had told her that they were Chris's followers. The girl was not interested in Lord Rode at the moment. If the knight's words were taken literally, then it was Chris who was supposed to be connected to the dark magician. Adila looked at Chris intently. Everything seemed strange and confusing. Chris couldn't literally set up an investigation against himself, let alone involve Adila in it. The man said that he had not been idle either. The culprit had left behind some clues. It turned out that Chris had also been looking for something all this time. Chris was no longer working for the order, and the lady was curious as to how he could have found out anything. The girl greatly underestimated her husband. Chris was going somewhere and called the lady with him. During the conversation, it turned out that the young people were heading to an accomplice who had found the evidence. Lady was shocked, because in front of her she saw her brother Sharon. Chris laughed and said that according to Adila's older brother, she herself asked for help with the investigation. The situation was gaining new momentum. Chris was in a great mood. He managed to gather a whole team of brother and sister. Adeli's reaction to the appearance of her older brother was amazing and made the men laugh a lot. Sharon said that he himself came to the city on an investigation and accidentally ran into Mr. Chris. The former commander-in-chief asked Sharon about his younger sister, and the man decided to share information about the investigation. Chris considered himself lucky to meet the future head of the Ravel family and also receive his support. The men hugged in a friendly way. Sharon was already aware that Adila had joined the battle against the dark magician's accomplices. The husband praised his sister because she had behaved with dignity, like a true daughter of the Ravel family. Still, the brother explained to his sister that she should put her life above debt. At that moment, Sharon showed a remarkable concern that had never been expected from him before. Adila found her brother's behavior quite strange. Chris was even moved, admiring such a close relationship between brother and sister. After a while, Chris left Sharon and Adila alone. As soon as Chris walked out the door, Sharon's behavior immediately changed. The man thought that Adila was a complete disappointment. Sharon wondered how her sister could lie down with wounds from a regular bomb and yet betray her identity to the dark magician's accomplices. Sharon considered Adila's actions a failure. According to her brother, Adila was casting a shadow over their family with her failure. Although the girl was upset by such accusations, she was still happy because she saw that in front of her was her real brother. Sharon had never spoiled her sister with a good attitude. So at first, her brother's behavior seemed strange to the girl. He acted like a completely different person. The girl even thought that her brother had a split personality. Sharon just waved his hand and noted that in high society, it was not customary to put one's true character on display. It's always better to be polite and kind to people to gain their support. Much to her brother's surprise, Adila was glad that Sharon hadn't gone crazy and behaved like a nasty boy. Suddenly, Chris entered the room. Sharon's other personality immediately awakened, and he became polite and pleasant. Chris said the clues were hidden in documents from when Mr. Chris was still commander-in-chief. These were the same reports that Adila had been asked to steal. Sharon analyzed all the reports and found evidence that the black magician was indeed in the order when Mr. Chris was still in his post. Chris just laughed after hearing the information. The man convinced the young people that he had no connection with the dark magicians. As an example, Sharon analyzed the charges brought against Mr. Chris. One of them was the theft of money from the treasury of the order. Chris confirmed that this had happened, but noted that money from the treasury was often taken by the royal family. One day, Chris was suspected of stealing from the order's treasury, but the man could not understand why he would do such a thing. The higher ranks believed that if Chris came from an ordinary family, he had a crazy thirst for money. When Chris was shown the financial statement for the previous month, he was shocked because he saw a large sum. Chris remembered well that he had never signed such a document. The man had been framed. All the reports had Chris's signatures, and he was asked to explain things. The man still remembers this with tears in his eyes. No one believed Chris. But looking at all the reports, there were indeed the husband's signatures. Chris swore to both Sharon and Adila that he would never have signed such a thing. Sharon believed Mr. Chris's words and confirmed that the documents had been given reality-altering magic. It all seemed strange, because Chris had specifically checked the documents for magic and found nothing. Sharon assured the man that he wouldn't have found anything. Someone had taken ordinary documents with a terrible design and applied reality-altering magic to it, creating a very ordinary tax document and giving it to him to sign. After signing such a document, the magic would disappear and anyone could become a criminal. Chris couldn't believe that this was even possible. Sharon assured the young people that he had not noticed anything at first either. Upon very careful analysis, Mr. Ravel had noticed a faint magical trace. Adila realized that with this evidence, they could clear Mr. Chris of all guilt. But first, they had to examine the documents for new evidence, because this was not enough. Chris sincerely thanked Sharon because her husband had helped him a lot. The conflicting conversation between brother and sister arose again. Chris wondered why their family members had such a strained relationship. When Sharon left, Adila explained that her brother was a scoundrel who was just playing for the audience. The young people decided to go out to dinner. On the way to the cafe, Chris was still glad that he had been lucky enough to connect with such intelligent siblings. It was even beneficial for the man, because if the Ravel family was on his side, he would be able to prove his innocence. Chris never stopped dreaming that he could get his job back, and then he was ready to make Rode his assistant. The young people laughed. The lady wondered what kind of man Rode was. He seemed like a cruel tyrant, but he was overly protective of Valero. He also didn't want to deal with the dark mage, and hated when Chris was mentioned by the other knights. Adila thought that of the entire order, Lord Rode seemed the most suspicious of all. Chris laughed, because the lady wanted to say that the brat might be somehow connected to the dark magicians. Chris Bleak had a completely opposite opinion. The man believed that Rode would never contact the mages, even under the threat of death. When Chris was still serving the order, Rode was his deputy, and they spent a lot of time together. Despite his youth, Rode was the most responsible guy Chris knew. And sometimes it was even unnerving. Chris knew the man better than anyone in the order. Mr. Blick admitted that when he was even accused of all the crimes and wanted to be put in prison, it was Rode who came and saved him. That day, Rode offered Chris to leave the order in exchange for his life. Rode protected Chris from justice, even though he was wanted for execution. Chris believed that if he hadn't known Rode, he wouldn't be alive anymore. Although Rode was pushy, annoying, and had a brother complex, he had a great sense of justice. Mr. Beck also had the same knightly honor that would never have gotten involved with dark magicians. Chris was indebted to Rode and decided to investigate on his own and deal with the dark magician once and for all. Mr. Bleak looked at Adila tenderly. For the first time in his life, someone had called him a friend. Chris wondered for a long time how the lady had managed to get along with Valero, a guy who couldn't stand people. After talking to Adila, Chris understood why he and Valero had become friends. Mr. Blick considered himself Adila's friend and debtor, and promised he would never betray her. The girl stood silently and just blinked her eyes. She couldn't understand what had come over Mr. Bleak, although she was glad that such a strong relationship had been established between them. The two characters in the novel, who had the most unfortunate fate, were eventually able to become friends and trust each other. Mr. Chris made a promise to Lady Adila. For a man like him, these words meant a lot. But Adila was still troubled by the words of those same nights. After such a promise, the lady was even ashamed to think that Chris was somehow connected with them. The girl wanted to let go of her baseless thoughts. From that day forward, Adila promised herself to try to trust Chris, no matter what. The young people continued to go to the cafe, but the problem was that Chris had completely forgotten where it was. The next day, Adila returned to the order. Of course, in the guise of the young man Dio. There were rumors that the young man had been seriously injured during the mission, and everyone was eager to know if this was true. Some felt sorry for Dio, some wondered why the young man had been sent, and some were indignant because the young man was just an ordinary recruit. A young man named Red was very worried about his new friend because there were various rumors circulating in the order. It was rumored that a dark magician had infiltrated the order and was recruiting new recruits. Red somehow decided that Dio had been dragged to the dark side. The guy was glad that his friend remained safe and sound. Another guy mentioned that he was also on a mission recently, and 2 recruits from his group went missing. The guy believed that in their line of work, it was not uncommon for soldiers to disappear. Another guy noted that only recruits, simpletons, were disappearing. The guys also had information that everything was connected to a dark magician. Dia couldn't understand why everyone in the order knew about the dark mage's existence. He asked Lady Him not to tell anyone about what had happened. Dia had been absent from the order for a week. It seemed as if everything had been done on purpose. Since the dark magician knew Dia by sight, the young man began to worry. Red placed a huge stack of documents next to Dia, as the young man had a lot of work to do during his vacation. Dia was upset, but he went to work. The young man worked until the very morning. It was time to take all the documents to the commander-in-chief. Dia was to appear before the Lord for the first time as a young man. Chris said that Rode was a very responsible boss. The guy hoped that such a meeting would go without problems. Barely holding all the documents, Dia knocked on the office door. But no one heard the knock, as it was quite loud inside. The guy carefully opened the door to see what was going on. Dia was shocked as an angry Chris shouted at Rode and pulled his outerwear. Mr. Bleak tried to convince Rode that he had witnesses. He could no longer turn a blind eye to the dark magician. Mr. Chris thrust the documents right into Rode's face. They were papers with a magical mark. Mr. Bleak insisted that Rode listen to him. The men had been arguing for a long time. They called each other names and couldn't come to a common opinion. Rode stubbornly refused to listen to Chris. Dia nevertheless dared to enter the office. Rode immediately asked the recruit to forget everything he had seen. Since the young man had done an excellent job, Rode allowed him to be free. Chris put his hand on Dia's shoulder as if they had known each other for a long time. Meanwhile, Rode asked the new recruit to ignore the old man and pointed out that he was leaving. A quarrel broke out between the men again. It seemed that it would never end. Rode could not stand it and slammed his fist on the table. The man also shouted that Chris was no longer a knight and ordered him to finally accept this truth. Mr. Bleak was strictly forbidden to even set foot in the order's building. But the cunning Chris couldn't think of anything better than to climb into Rode's office through the window in order to talk to him. Chris smiled. He had to do this because the entrance to the building was closed to him. Dio, hearing what Mr. Blick had done, laughed too. The conversation was over, and Rode considered that the affairs of the order were none of Chris's business. Enraged, Rode hit Chris in the face with his book. Mr. Bleak's nose bled. Rode felt uneasy because he hadn't done it on purpose. He was just overwhelmed by emotions. Dia could not remain silent. He also turned it to Mr. Rode, asking why he so stubbornly refused to talk to Mr. Chris, but Rode believed it that such things did not concern a new recruit. The situation was strange because everyone in the order was talking about the dark magician. The old comrade offered Rode help and even gave all the evidence. But the stubborn Rode, for some unknown reason, refused to consider any information. Adila had the impression that Rode was somehow connected with the dark magicians, and the girl openly said so. Rode noticed that the recruit was too pushy, and it occurred to him that he was just as simple as Chris. Rode couldn't let a scumbag like Dia tarnish his name. It even occurred to the man that Chris and Dia had conspired with dark magicians to destroy the knightly order from within. Quite unexpectedly, the door opened and agents from the royal palace came in. The chief of them called out to Dia and stated that the young man had been detained on suspicion of conspiring with dark magicians. Chris and Dia's mouths dropped open, but within minutes the young man was tied up. No one in the order could believe that Dia was an informant for the dark magician. Rode advised the cadets not to approach the young man. Adila was not going to give up. She asked everyone to calm down and assured them that this was slander, because she would never have contacted a dark magician. The lady pointed out that her only fault was that she had disguised herself as a young man. Adila wondered if anyone had any evidence that she was the one connected to the dark mage. When the girl turned her head to the side, she saw the same knights who had thrown the bomb next to her. The girl was almost speechless. Meanwhile, everyone present was surprised that the young men were alive. They were both reported missing after a mission accompanied by the Baron's daughter. The impudent youths exclaimed that the agents from the royal palace had been proven right. The worried young men told them that during their mission, Dia suddenly appeared and attacked them. The cadets confirmed that Dia had used a spell on them that they had never seen before. The young men also noted that when they were on the verge of death, Dia suddenly disappeared. Although everything was completely different, it seemed that no one believed the frightened Dia. All the people around looked askance at the young man, considering his actions daring and illegal. Commander-in-Chief Rodelvard claimed that Dio was the one with ties to the dark magicians. The man advised the young man to confess his guilt, since all the evidence pointed to him. It turned out that Dio had been treated the same way as Chris had been treated. The young man turned to Rode, explaining to him that it was strange and reckless to trust two people who could also deceive him. The young man tried to explain that he had only joined the orders he had dreamed and had no intention of getting involved with a dark magician. The commander-in-chief's words were completely empty. Suddenly, Dio felt goosebumps. He looked around and saw strange looks from people, filled with contempt and distrust. The young man was an ordinary recruit. Of course, people were ready to believe someone who had served in the order for several years, and not an ordinary guy who had appeared a few days ago. Dio was saddened and realized that no one would believe him, no matter what he said, no matter how hard he tried to deny it. Adila had actually returned to what she had tried so hard to hide from, and again she repeated her fate. Mr. Chris thought it was time to end this whole farce. The man winked at Adila. People began to whisper as Mr. Bleak appeared before them. No one could figure out what the man had forgotten on the estate. Chris was forbidden to enter the territory of the order, and his appearance was quite a surprise to those around him. Then the situation took an unexpected turn. Mr. Blick grabbed the young man Dio by the hair and loudly pointed out that because of an idiot like him, the plan to seize the order failed. The young man looked at the man with frightened eyes, but could not understand what was happening. Chris kept staring at Dio, accusing him of not thinking about the consequences at all. The man loudly admitted that now everyone knew about their accomplice, the dark magician. Everyone around him was shocked by such a shocking statement. Dio was frightened and decided that he would definitely die after such words. Instead, Rode got angry with Chris and asked what it all meant. Mr. Bleak laughed and said that it was Rode who had put on the show. Chris accused Rode of attacking the recruit with his colleagues, convinced that he was the real criminal. Mr. Bleak considered Rode and his colleagues imbeciles. Chris said that no one noticed the obvious from the beginning and admitted that he simply used the gullible Dio for his own purposes. Dio couldn't believe that Chris was somehow connected to dark magicians. The guy thought that he and his husband had a fairly trusting relationship, but it all turned out to be a complete lie. Chris proudly declared that everyone around him was an idiot and that he was the real criminal. Mr. Bleak also added that before his retirement, he had worked side by side with dark magicians. When Chris was released, he had to find a spy boy to do his dirty work. The men who had recently dropped the bomb on Dio thought Chris was bluffing, but for some reason, the men were convinced that Chris was protecting the brat, the new recruit. They believed that Mr. Bleak would never stoop to collaborating with the dark magicians. The situation was quite strange. Chris believed that the men were more stupid than he thought. Mr. Bleak admitted his guilt and was surprised by such an extraordinary reaction from those around him. Chris said that Dio was just his pawn and didn't even know about the dark mage. The man used him as well as everyone else in the room. Finally, Rode could not stand it anymore and ordered the knights to arrest Chris. Red tried to encourage the young man and shared his concerns with him. Red explained to Dio that Chris was just manipulating him. He also asked Dio to calm down, as he did not want to have Chris arrested. Soon, Dio was informed that Mr. Bleak, the former commander-in-chief, was in cahoots with the dark magicians, and he, a new recruit, was merely used for their own purposes. Dio rebelled. He tried to explain to the men that this was not true. Jose, because he worked with Chris of his own free will, and no one forced him to do anything. The young man asked to be allowed to talk to Mr. Bleak. The boy was tried to be convinced that he could not have known that he had not been lied to. The persuasion was a typical example of dark magic. The boy was simply made a loyal pawn by means of a spell. That was why no one would let Dio see Chris. It was later reported that Mr. Bleak would soon be on trial. If the man were found guilty, he should have been executed as someone who tried to destroy the empire from within. As in the novel, Chris was arrested. He was found guilty and executed for treason. Adila was saddened because she realized that she probably could not change the course of events that the author had prescribed. The lady also wondered if she should change anything at all. Adila remembered the moment when Chris decided to take all the blame on himself. Then it seemed to the girl that the man spoke with striking seriousness. Chris died almost at the very beginning of the novel. He was only a minor character whom Adila never met. The only thing the lady knew about was his dismissal and the gossip that spread around the city. When Dio was released, he finally breathed his last, although the fact that Chris was in prison gnawed at the young man from the inside. A saddened Adila wandered near the estate in the rain. Sharon warned her sister that going out in the rain could end badly. In the morning, the lady developed a bad runny nose. She became ill. Adila claimed that she could think better in the pouring rain. The girl knew she had made a mistake in saving Lady Yoma. She didn't need to come out and show her face. Adila blamed herself for the fact that such a misfortune had happened to her because of her rash act. Chris had been in great danger precisely because of Adila. Sharon had never heard humility in his sister's voice. Although thinking about it, he noticed that before the headbutt, the girl had behaved in a similar way. The man felt uncomfortable remembering all this. He felt like some kind of monster. It became obvious to the man that something had happened to his sister. He insisted that she tell him what was wrong. Adila confessed that it all started when she went to Lord Rhodes' office. Then Chris confessed everything and was arrested. Sharon finally understood why Adila looked like a depressed goose. The man thought something serious had happened. He convinced his sister that they had to get Chris out because there was evidence. Adila could not understand anything at all. Chris himself admitted that he was connected with the dark magician and that he simply used the girl. The gentlemen from the royal palace were sure that Mr. Bleak had used the magic of persuasion on Adila. The lady didn't know who to believe anymore. Sharon looked at his sister in surprise and found it funny that she also believed the show that Chris had put on. The brother tried to convince his sister that Mr. Bleak was bluffing, and it was obvious. Sharon clutched his head. He realized that the lady had managed to seduce Duke Beck's second son, but she had absolutely no understanding of human feelings. Then it occurred to the girl that Chris could have used the magic of persuasion on Sharon as well. The man suggested that even if the girl's words were true, and he was really connected to the dark magicians, then there was no point in Chris protecting the lady. Chris put himself at risk, saving Adila. The girl, after thinking, still believed Sharon. The man noticed that logic was not his sister's strong point. The girl was overloaded with unnecessary information, and this caused her doubts. But the man noted the fact that his sister had never made a mistake in choosing people she could trust. That day, the brother really supported his sister. In the novel, Sharon would never have done that. It meant that Adila really managed to change the course of events, at least a little. To save Chris from prison, Sharon suggested that Adila go to the Duchy of Beck. The lady was a little embarrassed because she was forbidden to appear on the territory of the duchy. Adila underestimated her brother. He knew what trouble his sister always got into. The door to the main entrance for the lady was closed, but no one prevented her from climbing in through the window. Adila laughed, thinking that she and Sharon were definitely related. In fact, it wasn't the first time the lady had climbed through Valerdo's window. When the young people entered Valerdo's bedroom, Adila could not find the young man anywhere. Finally, looking closely, the girl noticed the owner of the room. For some unknown reason, Valerdo was lying on the bed, his head wrapped in a blanket. He asked not to shout or disturb his sleep. Valerdo looked tired. The young man's face looked as if he had already had a fight with someone. The young man asked the lady to leave him alone. He believed that the girl was none of his business. Adila proudly pointed out that she was the young man's future bride and wanted to know all the details of the young man's disappointing appearance. The lady touched Valerdo's hand, and it seemed to snap from its place. The young man shouted for the girl not to touch him. Valerdo lowered his head. He made no secret of the fact that if the lady defeated him in a duel, they would break off their engagement. Adila had indeed said so at their first meeting. Valerdo didn't look so much angry as very upset. He raised his tired gaze and told the girl straight in the eye that she was nothing to him. He also asked the young man not to give him false hope. Adila realized that something had happened to her future fiancé after their last meeting. She noticed that the young man had had a hard time. Adila only asked not to hit her on the hands. She was ready to listen to all the boy's emotional experiences, but Valerdo quietly muttered to the girl to leave. Adila stubbornly continued to sit next to the guy. The guy thought it was a violation of personal boundaries. Such words made the lady want to leave, but she asked him to remember that she would always be on the guy's side. Valerdo muttered quietly that Adila was very strong. No matter what was said to the girl, and no matter what troubles she faced, she never gave up and fought proudly against everything. Adila could not understand why Valerdo began to praise her so much. In the girl's opinion, the young man was just like her. He did not listen to anyone and did whatever he wanted, but the young man denied such words of the lady. No matter how hard Valerdo tried, he always failed at everything. Strong people turned their strength into weapons, but the young man never had anything like that. He could only watch and envy the people who succeeded. Adila was convinced that Valerdo was a capable swordsman. When the young people first met, the boy didn't even use a sword and didn't want to look. It was all because of his brother. Valerdo was told that he wasn't capable of it. Adila knew for sure that if the young man took the sword seriously, everyone would recognize its power, even Lord Rode. Valerdo could not stand it and shouted loudly for the girl to stop telling tales. The guy quickly grabbed Adila by the outerwear. He was extremely angry because the girl knew absolutely nothing about him. Adila, on the contrary, believed that the guy was lying to himself, and he knew it very well. The boy had resigned himself to being called a loser and was afraid of surpassing his older brother. That was the lady's opinion, but Valerdo stubbornly refused to listen to it, believing that Adila had lost her mind. Mr. Chris spent a lot of time teaching Adila the art of the sword, and even taught her the basics of unfair combat. But every time Adila fought Valerdo, the boy easily outclassed her. Even without daily training, Valerdo was a good martial artist. The girl didn't even want to hear the guy's ridiculous excuses. Adila took the boy by the hand and tried to convince him that his sword should serve the people, not hide in the shadow of Rode. But Valerdo was so desperate that he begged the girl to stop her sweet lies. As a child, the boy dreamed of becoming a knight. The Becks were a family of warriors who founded a knightly order. The love of fencing was in the blood of that family. But Valerdo's father and his brother argued to the boy that he was not suitable for the role of a swordsman. Adila couldn't even imagine how little Valerdo must have felt when the same thing was hammered into his head. Every time the boy took up the sword, his father looked at him with disgust. Looking into his father's eyes, Valerdo understood one truth. If he continued to practice fencing, his husband would abandon him. Adila was convinced that Valero was talking nonsense. She also considered Lord Rode and his father to be complete idiots. The girl tried to explain to the boy that they were wrong. Even Adila, who could not defeat Valero, was able to pass the selection and become a knight. The girl was convinced that with such excellent skills, the young man would definitely be able to become a knight. Adila tried her best to motivate Valero. It was the truth, and the girl was literally crawling out of her skin to at least somehow raise the self-esteem of the guy who was truly an excellent fencer. Adila took Valero by the hands and looked him in the eye. She said confidently that she would not stop repeating endlessly that the boy could become a wonderful knight. Despite the words of his family, who told the young man that he would never succeed because he was untalented, Adila wanted the boy to pull himself together and make his dream come true. Since Adila was an active knight, she pointed out that Valero should trust her professional opinion. The young people had lived their entire lives in the shadows of people who had never loved them. Adila suggested that the boy do whatever he wanted from that moment on. But the young man just lowered his head, not wanting to get screwed over by his father again. The lady laughed and suggested using a surprise attack against the man. Valero's father was a war hero and former commander-in-chief of the order. So the young man just took a deep breath, knowing that he would never be able to defeat him in his life. Adila said that when she lost her temper, she forced an impudent servant to eat moldy bread. She also cut down the largest tree in the garden to prove her magical powers to the family. And the most interesting thing is that, to shut her stepmother's mouth, Adila poured water on her until she fainted. Hearing this, Valero's mouth dropped open. As it turned out, Adila was more vengeful than the young man had expected. The girl offered to personally use her magic to put an end to Valero's father's arrogance, but the guy asked Adila to stop being such a maniac. In fact, the girl wanted to prove to the guy that no one but him could decide his fate. A person was capable of anything he set his mind to. All he had to do was not listen to anyone, pull himself together, and fight to the end. Adila's strength simply amazed Valero's imagination. He listened to the girl with pleasure. Adila seemed like a girl with terrible manners, who was the subject of pathetic gossip. She was also considered completely antisocial and hopeless. She did whatever she wanted and didn't listen to anyone. But despite such a repulsive character, Valero was captivated by the beauty of her beautiful eyes, in which one could read the confidence in her own words. The mere appearance of the girl pushed all of Valero's worries to the background. The girl literally burst into the guy's house in the middle of the night while he was trying to sleep. But this meeting was so welcome. Adila smiled and asked for forgiveness for her impudence. In fact, she had come to ask Valero to lead her to Lord Rode's room. To save Chris, Sharon gave her younger sister a responsible task. Adila had to steal evidence from the Lord's room. In Valero's eyes, it looked as if the girl's own brother was sending her to commit a crime. The guy himself didn't understand why, but he believed Adila and happily let her into Rode's room. The young people were lucky because no one noticed them. Valero's father was away at the time, and the servants asked the young men not to go up to the second floor at night. Adila was quite surprised because the guy easily agreed to show her his older brother's room. In fact, the lady could not even think that the young man would agree to help her. Valero was convinced that if he refused, Adila would have climbed into the room and caused a mess. The boy himself suspected that his older brother was hiding something. Every time someone asked Rode about his work, the Knights, or the Order, he flatly refused to talk about it. It wasn't just Valero who noticed this. Chris also understood that Rode knew about the Dark Mage being in the Order. However, Chris did nothing about it. Valero gathered his thoughts and asked to put the chatter aside. He suggested that the lady take what she wanted and leave. According to Sharon, Adila needed to find a petition or something else suspicious. The young man just shrugged as there was a huge amount of documents on the table. The young man had no idea how the girl was going to find what she needed in the huge mountain of documents. The young people decided to sort everything out and then start searching. Valero looked down and noticed a letter in a bottle. Adila decided that it could be a letter from her beloved Rode. But Valero denied the lady's words, since his brother was definitely not dating anyone. Valero easily uncorked the bottle and pulled out the letter. The young men gasped, not from surprise. The stranger asked Lord Rodebeck to save Mr. Chris. In the letter, the stranger confessed that he had made a pact with the dark magician. The man wrote that he was supposed to kill the aristocrat he was assigned to escort and make it look like an accident. The dark magician offered the contractor a good sum of money, and he agreed. The young people dropped the letter from their hands, and in fear they plunged into each other's arms. Valero and Adila read the secret link with the confession of guilt, but threw it away without finishing it. The guy suggested that the girl calm down and still read the contents. The stranger asked the Lord to read the letter to the end before throwing it away. The man swore that he would never betray the order under any circumstances. He even suggested that the dark magician had used a persuasion spell on him. The end of the letter sounded like a real apology. It occurred to Valero that the letter had been written by a nobleman. At the moment of the deal, Mr. Chris unexpectedly appeared and beat the dark magician. It was then that the spell of persuasion was lifted from the stranger. The man didn't have time to look around when he and the dark magician found themselves on the street. And it was an area the man had never seen before. The magician ordered the man to kill the commander with his own hands and threatened to end his life if he refused. The unfortunate stranger did not want to kill Chris, so he proposed another plan. According to the plan, Mr. Blick was to be dismissed in disgrace. It was the executor who came up with the idea of framing Chris in the order's tax fraud. The stranger frankly admitted that he had no forgiveness, because sooner or later the magicians would reveal that he was a traitor. But the man did not want his life to be in vain. He asked Lord Rode to restore Mr. Chris's good name. Valero realized that the letter he held in his hands proved that Rode knew everything. His brother had information that a dark magician had infiltrated the Knight's Order, and that Chris had never been guilty. Adila also understood that Mr. Bleak was right, and had never lied to her. But Valero was worried that Chris had said something to the lady that made her doubt him. Valero decided that Adila had broken into his house to make sure of Chris's innocence. The young man even thought that his future bride was having an affair on the side. The young man had enough time and came to the conclusion that everything that was happening to Adila, that is, getting into the order and the threat of death, began after she contacted Chris. Valero looked at Adila intently and asked her directly why she had risked so much for her husband. Come to think of it, Chris had done nothing for the lady. Valero didn't expect such an answer, but the lady quite calmly admitted that Mr. Chris was her friend. He was the first to accept the girl for who she really was, so Adila wasn't going to leave Mr. Blick alone with his problems. Valero felt ashamed of his assumptions and made excuses that he had simply not slept well, and that was why all sorts of nonsense had come to his mind. Nevertheless, Adila noted that Lord Rode was clearly up to something. Although Adila didn't know the Lord well enough after finding the letter, he didn't inspire her with any trust at all. The lady smiled and said that Valero didn't inspire any trust or positive feelings in her at first either. But as time passed, everything changed. Adila realized that Valero had become a friend to her as well. Lady came to the conclusion that she needed to get closer to Rode in order to understand him. Valero looked away in embarrassment and muttered that the girl was too bright. Adila looked at the boy in confusion. He gathered his courage and remarked that the lady was unsurpassed. Valero didn't have the strength to keep everything to himself, so he told me that he admired Adila. Previously, the guy was afraid to move forward. His whole family was against him, and he closed in on himself. The boy considered his family his enemies and wouldn't let anyone near him, lest they hurt him. But later, Valero met Adila and realized that only he was the master of his own destiny. That was why the young man wanted to know what Adila's older brother Sharon was up to and what was going on in the knightly order. Valero immediately explained that he wanted to help the lady find out the whole truth. The girl was so happy that she threw herself into the boy's arms. She felt incredibly happy that she and Valero would work together to save Mr. Chris. In fact, Valero, participating in such a dangerous adventure, did not benefit at all. But the boy made such a decision himself. For the first time in a long time, Valero made his own decisions. Adila reminded the boy that if he did decide to take up the sword again, he would succeed. In fact, the young man needed someone who could sincerely believe in him from the very beginning. Since Adila was very confident in Valero, he promised not to let her down. Adila inspired the boy to do something more, something he himself would never have dared to do. The young man had been so squeezed and shown the way since childhood that he had completely forgotten how to do it. Chris was in the dungeon of the royal palace. Rode decided to visit him. Mr. Blick had been in prison for the second time and had even gotten used to it. The man was pleased that at least someone had come to visit him. Of course, it was ironic, because Chris had ended up in prison to save Adila. Compared to the last time, Chris felt like he was at a resort. He had a bed and 3 meals a day, even though his hands were in shackles. But Rode was not joking. He glared at Chris and asked why the man had covered up the recruit. Mr. Bleak said that he could not watch the top brass of the order ruin the young man's life. Mr. Chris smiled and said that maybe he was also affected by dark magic and was guilty of all these crimes. But Mr. Bleak was definitely convinced that Dio was not guilty of anything. Rode was not amused because his old friend Chris was facing a harsh punishment for such an accusation. The man was to be executed sometime later. Chris just looked down and said that he had finally found proof that a dark mage had infiltrated the order. Mr. Bleak was even willing to give his life to see that asshole caught. Chris believed that Rode knew the whole truth about the dark magician. Mr. Bleak had initially been reluctant to pour all the slander on himself, but after that conversation with the new recruit, Rode accused the poor guy of all the dark magician's sins. Rode knew very well that the problems with that rat had started back when Chris was the commander-in-chief of the order. Rodelvard's frightened look betrayed him. Rode was afraid that all the secrets of the order were about to be revealed, and Mr. Blick knew it well. That was what he saw in the man's eyes. Meanwhile, Adila was with her brother. She had finished all the work on the Beck estate. Sharon praised the young lady and asked her to go home. The man himself was ready to go further in hot pursuit. Adila wanted to go with her brother, but Sharon didn't even want to listen to her. He noticed how his sister was getting more and more arrogant every day. Sharon was curious to know what Adila had found at the Beck estate. When the lady handed her brother a secret letter, the man jumped for joy. Adila had found substantial evidence of Chris's innocence, and it was brilliant news. Although it was a letter from an ordinary knight, it was still evidence. Sharon was as happy as a little child, and Adila even liked it. Looking closer, the man noticed that it was an ordinary duplicate. He wondered where Adila had put the real letter. Valero took the real letter, and the lady made a duplicate with magic. Sharon's mouth dropped open, because even he didn't know how to do that. But that wasn't the point. Sharon couldn't understand why Adila would give the letter to her second son Beck when his older brother was the prime suspect. It was Rode who had put Chris behind bars. Adila explained to her brother that Valero was not their enemy, and he promised to cooperate. Sharon did not like her sister's behavior at all, because trusting strangers was a fatal mistake. Valero's promises were worthless without a contract. Adila was confused and thought Sharon had some trust issues. The brother and sister had radically different views on the Valero account. Meanwhile, Valero Beck lay thoughtfully in his bed. The young man thought he had said something absurd to Adila, but he immediately reassured himself that everything was fine. Valero promised to help Adila. He was ready to clarify to his brother's intentions. Suddenly, the young man heard someone's voice. When he looked around, he noticed Rode, who had returned earlier than planned. It was the first time the boy had seen his brother so angry. It was not at all clear who the man was talking to. Rode seemed to be talking to someone, but there was no one around. Rodelvard claimed to have done everything according to plan, and even had Chris thrown in prison, but nothing changed. The secret of the order was at risk. Valero couldn't stand it anymore and decided to take a peek to see who his brother was talking to. To the young man's great surprise, Rodelvard was talking to a cat. The young man was confused and even began to worry about his brother's mental health. Rodelvard shouted at the cat in the middle of the night, and Valero didn't even know how to react. The young man was almost speechless when he heard the cat speak in a human voice. Keith noted that Lord Rode was an ungrateful man who had dreamed of the post of commander-in-chief all his life, and yet he had received it. In return, Mr. Beck allowed him to use the order for his own purposes. Kit believed that Rodelvard was to blame for agreeing to the deal without considering all the risks, because he should have thought, for example, About Adila. Lord Rode had been dealing with the dark magician for many years, but he knew nothing about him, neither his name nor his appearance. The magician always appeared in the guise of various animals. The dark mage, who in this case was a cat, noted that he had never met anyone better than a lady named Adila. The girl's abilities were incredible. Her true magical potential had not yet awakened because she was not mature enough. At such a young age, Adila demonstrated incredible results. The girl was beautiful not only in strength. She was very beautiful, intelligent, and knew how to find an approach to any person. The dark mage noted that Adila had even managed to find an approach to Valero. The lady also almost revealed the dark mage's identity. Every time the subject of the Ravel family's daughter came up, the dark magician simply couldn't stop himself. It seemed that he himself was enchanted by the lady's beauty and skills. Although the dark magician had never spoken to Adila personally, he knew everything about her. Rodelvard advised the cat not to be so fond of the girl because he believed that she was not who she claimed to be. The dark magician became angry and asked him to never again throw dirt on Adila. He also noted that the Ravel family had started to dig under Rodelvard. Although the dark magician liked Adila, he did not care about her family. The magician considered Sharon to be particularly problematic, as the young man was quite intelligent and could cause a lot of problems in the future. The dark magician did not want unnecessary trouble and warned Rode that from that day on, the dark magicians would leave the order. The dark magician pointed out that Chris would be accused of all sins and executed. In that case, there would be no more evidence against Rode. Suddenly, the cat laughed, and it occurred to him that Rodelvard felt sorry for Chris. The dark magician came up with the perfect plan and framed Chris so that no one would believe him. But Rode did not have him executed, but simply released him. Keith thought that there wouldn't be so many problems in Rode if he killed Mr. Bleak right away. Suddenly, the dark magician had an idea. He suggested that they cast a persuasion spell on Chris, and in that case, he would become their ally. Last time, the dark magician had failed to subdue Chris due to his strong will, but now the man was in prison awaiting execution. Kit was sure that Mr. Bleak had no will left to live. The magician intended to use Chris as a puppet. It occurred to the cat that Rodelvard had planned to betray him. He believed that Rodelvard had the guts to tell people everything. Valero witnessed the pitiful conversation. He would never have believed that his own brother had contacted a dark magician in order to become commander-in-chief. The dark magician spoke and decided to say goodbye to Rodelvard after all, as he still had many urgent matters to attend to. Rode was furious, but he knew what he was getting into. The man had sacrificed a lot to become commander-in-chief. Rodelvard wanted to keep it all a secret at all costs for the honor of the Beck family. Behind the man stood his brother. Valero decided not to remain silent, but immediately noted that his brother had spoken very bold words. Rodelvard turned pale. Meanwhile, Adila and Sharon were on their way somewhere. When the girl learned that they were going to Duke Beck's estate, she was almost speechless. Sharon calmly explained that Mr. Beck was a busy man and was constantly on the move. Fortunately, at that time, the man was staying not far from the capital. Adila thought that meeting with Valero and looking for evidence was normal, but going to his father was too much. Sharon had a plan to corner Mr. Beck and, through threats, expose the true nature of his dear eldest son. Sharon hoped that Mr. Beck might cooperate with them under the threat of embarrassment. The man intended to exploit his fear to free Chris. Sharon, unlike Adila, was not going to be friends with anyone. The man also asked his sister to return home soon because his father was already beginning to suspect him of cheating. Adila turned pale. She was very afraid of her father's reaction to the fact that she had actually infiltrated the order as a young man. Also, the fact that she was looking for dark magicians would not be pleasant for her father. The maiden began to cry. She tried to convince her brother that they would let her advise them on everything and figure it out without their father's involvement. Sharon had a plan. He wanted to tell his father everything, but not mention his sister, as if she had nothing to do with it. The man looked at Adila tenderly and said that his father loved her. Instead, the lady just laughed. She would never have believed in the sincerity of a father's love. Perhaps, somewhere deep down, he loved his daughter, but he never showed it. In fact, the father became more lenient towards his daughter when he learned about her magical powers. But there was no talk of love. The lady was simply useful to her father, and she knew it well. The girl refused to believe that one of her relatives had fallen in love with her so suddenly. Sharon, on the contrary, was indignant and noted that her sister understood nothing about human feelings. Adila wanted to say something to her brother, but suddenly she fell silent and lowered her head. It turned out that the girl had not slept for more than a day and dozed off for a second. Considering the past few weeks, it was no wonder that the lady was tired. There had been so many events that it was breathtaking. While the young people were on the road, Sharon suggested that her sister rest and not think about anything. The girl decided to listen to her brother, so she immediately laid her head on his lap. Fatigue was taking its toll. She couldn't even sit up. Her eyes were closing on their own. To Adila's great surprise, Sharon carefully covered her sister with a blanket and gently stroked her shoulder. This was the first time. No one had ever worried about the girl. Adila thought for a moment. Her brother had really changed a lot lately. He had become different, attentive and caring. The girl really liked these changes. Still, her brother's excessive calmness alarmed her. The man gladly suggested that his sister take a nap. Sharon's behavior was completely different from her usual behavior, and it occurred to the lady that she had to change the plot of the book at least a little. Sharon said that if her sister didn't get enough sleep, she would immediately fall at Mr. Beck's feet when they met, and then he would have to explain why this happened. The conversation between Valero and Rodelvard continued. The younger brother asked with a smile who Rode was talking to. The young man also handed his older brother a bottle containing a confession from an unknown man. Rode turned pale. Valero asked the man what it was. Rode was furious that his younger brother had dared to rummage through his personal belongings. Despite the man's immense rage, his heart nearly leaped out of his chest. The man was worried that his secret had been revealed. Rodelvard knew about the dark mage and that Chris was innocent. The letter was a clue, because if the royal family read it, all charges against Chris would be dropped. Valero looked at his brother intently and asked why he had hidden the letter from everyone. But Rodelvard did not want to give up. His younger brother had overheard his conversation with the dark magician, and that fact had made the man very angry. It occurred to Valero that his brother might have burned the letter, but he seemed to want someone to find it. That fact troubled the young man. The circumstances were very strange. The young man was very worried that the cat knew a lot of information about his future bride. Valero wanted to hear at least some explanation from his brother to clarify the situation. Rodelvard noticed how his brother had changed, befriending the daughter of the Ravel family, and also starting to poke his nose into other people's affairs. Such character traits were completely out of character for the young man. The man reminded Valero that there had been an earlier conversation about his being unconcerned with matters within the estate. That was why Rode categorically did not want either Valero or Chris to poke their noses into other people's business. Rodelvard knew very well about his brother's secret meetings with Adila and asked not to be taken for a fool. Rodel assured Valero that Adila was simply manipulating him, trying to win him over to her side. Rode claimed that the lady simply wanted to sow discord between the brothers. The man believed that Valero was nothing to Adila, but for the first time in his life, the young man decided to resist his brother. Enraged, Valero pinned his brother against the wall. The young man glared at Rodelvard. He could not allow his fiancée to continue to be slandered. Rode understood that his brother had objected to him. Moreover, the young man was not defending himself, but someone else. The man immediately understood that love had broken out between the young people. At least on Valero's part, for sure. Rodelvard was convinced that love had so confused his brother that he had not seen the whole truth. The man pushed Valero hard, and he fell to the ground. Rode glared at his brother with anger and intensity. Rodelvard forced Valero to choose between his family and Adila. The young man's life depended on his answer. Rode held a sword in his hands and was serious. Meanwhile, Adila was sleeping soundly. Brother Sharon's knees were so soft and comfortable that the girl finally fell asleep. She stood up, stretched her arms out, and yawned. Valero didn't know how the girl could sleep for so long and do nothing. The carriage doors opened, and the young man ordered her to get out quickly. The young man also asked her to stop making him wait. Adila couldn't understand what Valero was doing next to her, or where Sharon had gone. The girl thought the young man was speaking to her too rudely. After what she saw, the lady decided that she had lost her mind. Next to her was the same woman from the novel. She asked Valero for forgiveness and started to get out of the carriage. The lady could not understand anything at all. She silently blinked her eyes. Before falling asleep, Adila was driving with Sharon. When she woke up, she saw Valero and another version of herself next to her. It occurred to the lady that this was a dream. She had no other explanation. Looking closer, the girl noticed that the new Adila and Valero were older. They were probably 18 years old. Valero treated Adila just terribly, just like in the plot according to the novel. The girl finally remembered why she hated Valero before. The lady decided to follow the young man. After some time, the young man met with his father. The man thanked his son for everything, because thanks to him, the Ravel family was completely under the control of the Beck family. Adila was transported into the future so suddenly that she was convinced it was a dream. The gap between recent events and what she had seen was quite large. The father of the Beck family told his son that he would inherit the rule of the Ravel family, and his brother Rode would rule the Beck family, as he had grown up to be a reliable man. The father congratulated his son, as he had fulfilled his role. It was extremely terrifying to watch such events. Valero's father told him directly that he was no longer needed by their family. In fact, Adila was even jealous of Valero, because she dreamed that her father would one day say that. Upon learning of his daughter's magical powers, the father of the Ravel family drastically changed his attitude towards Adila. The girl again witnessed the conversation between Adila and Valero. The young man behaved frankly terribly with the lady. He did not value her words and thoughts. And because the girl wanted to say something, Valero became very angry. Adila didn't even have the right to open her mouth. Valero threw mud at her, saying that such an uncouth monkey should silently show himself to be a normal person. The young man also ordered that the girl should not come into his sight that day. The lady had heard many terrible words spoken to her that day. This attitude was stable and systematic. She watched as Adila sat down and became sad. Nevertheless, the already grown-up Adila whispered out loud that no one could speak to her like that. Not her father, not her brother, not her own fiancé. The lady already dreamed that this horror she was witnessing would end as soon as possible. The girl wanted to be reborn as soon as possible, because that's when she would be able to put everyone in their place. Rodelvard approached Adila. It was as if the former Adila was invisible. She was just standing nearby, as if watching some kind of performance. To the lady's great surprise, Rodelvard apologized for his younger brother, noting that in his youth he had often walked among common people and had probably picked up various nonsense from them during that time. Rode intended to talk to his younger brother about his behavior. The man was constantly drinking something. It was antidepressants. Unfortunately, if Rode were to stop taking his antidepressants, his body would shake non-stop, and he would eventually become anxious. The man was terrifying to watch. Rode admitted that he liked Adila. The man realized with regret that he could never be like her. Suddenly, something began to shine brightly on the girl. The radiance filled the entire room. The man felt sorry for Valero's treatment of his fiancée. Despite everything, he wanted their conversation to remain a secret. The girl watched the situation in surprise and noticed that Rode was in love with Adila. Meanwhile, Lady Ravel was also politely chatting with her husband. The conversation between the young people was gentle and pleasant. Rodelvard literally showered Adila with compliments, and she liked it. Mr. Beck admitted that he was increasingly looking for meetings with a lady, because only next to her could he completely relax. Adila reciprocated the man. It seemed that something had flared up between the young people. Lord Rode even suggested that it was fate that brought him and Adila together. The girl could not understand what was happening. She wanted to wake up from this strange dream as soon as possible. The young people confessed to each other that they were looking for meetings. Rodelvard couldn't wait to finally take Adil for himself. The further the girl watched everything, the more shocked she was. The lady's eyes bulged and her mouth opened. She didn't even want to listen to the rest. The novel was not about that at all, and the events completely deviated from reality. The girl was completely confused. Adila was Valerdo's fiancé, and his older brother Rode was no good. The lady was surprised by the atmosphere that reigned around. In front of the girl, Rodelvard and Adila kissed. The lady could do nothing but watch in silence. Events took a strange turn, because in the original novel, Adila and Rodelvard did not even communicate much. The girl thought for a moment. In fact, the novel did not say a word about Adila's relationship with Rodelvard. Then it occurred to the lady that the author simply did not describe such events in the novel, since it would not have affected the further plot anyway. The girl had no choice but to follow the main character, Adila. That evening, Lady Ravel went to an aristocratic ball for the first time. The location changed again. Rode pretended to be someone else, even though he was actually a complete villain. He understood that he was a puppet of his own father who controlled the knightly order. The man admitted to himself that he could not cope with excessive pressure, which is why he drank liters of antidepressants. Rodelvard considered himself not a knight, but a pathetic parody. Mr. Beck tried with all his might to live up to his image. Adila couldn't understand what purpose the man had in being commander-in-chief if it only brought him pain and suffering. Meanwhile, the lady continued to watch the events. It occurred to her that if she had really been in a dream and had seen another part of the novel that the author had not prescribed, then Chris should have been executed long ago. Rode was involved in business with a black magician. The girl did not understand him at all and did not know what controlled him. Lord Beck was ready to protect his younger brother so much that he was not ashamed to drown him in a swamp. Rodelvard was even willing to execute his best friend in order to save face. The girl could not understand how Adila could fall in love with such a scumbag. If Rode were a thief, Adila might hate him with all her heart. But something was wrong and she could feel it. Events flashed back. Rodelvard held his sword in front of Valero. The man even began to mock his younger brother because he had never hit him and could not even get to his feet. Suddenly, Rode put his sword aside. He found Valerdo's movements strange and reminiscent of Chris's style. But knowing his brother's stubbornness, he would never go to learn from a simpleton. Rode admitted that Valero could have been fighting someone with a similar fighting style and simply copied it. He was referring to Adila. Suddenly, Valero quickly got up. The young man looked at his brother intently and said that even if he didn't beat him, he would still send a letter of confession to the newspaper on behalf of his father. In that case, the letter would make headlines across the country. Rode considered this a base act, but Valero did not care. Rodelvard decided to scare his brother that if the world saw the letter, something irreparable would happen. This will clear Chris's name, but such a simpleton will still never be able to become commander-in-chief. Rode thought that the fact that a simpleton had risen to such a high position and become commander-in-chief was absurd. The Beck family had ruled the knightly order for generations, and this was their place by birth. Rodelvard wanted to live up to his father's expectations by any means necessary. Otherwise, he assured Valero that he would have to take that place. Rode asked his brother to think about it, because that was the reason he didn't want Valero to take up the sword. If Rodelvard failed to fulfill his duties, Valero would be forced to become the head of the family. Rode's entire life had been a series of pain and suffering in pursuit of his father's approval. So the man didn't want his younger brother to go through that hell. Rode did not want his brother to be a puppet of his father, but rather to live his life as he wanted. It turned out that Rodelvard became commander-in-chief for the sake of his younger brother's normal life. Lord Beck lived his whole life in fear that his brother would end up in the same situation as he had. The man was ready to accept any abuse and live up to his father's expectations. But after his father severely beat Valero, Rodelvard decided that he would make a deal with the dark magicians. It was they who promised Rode safety and prosperity, and in return asked to conduct their experiments within the walls of the order. However, the eldest son of the Ravel family suspected something bad, and so the order decided to blame Chris for everything that happened. But this did not mean that Rodelvard wanted Mr. Bleak dead. Lord Beck was ready to become a sinner, and he wanted to do everything to please his father. The man wanted to keep his position so that Valero could live freely. That's why Rodelvard begged his brother to take his side, at least this time. The man only wanted to save Valero, but things didn't turn out the way he wanted. Valero knew absolutely nothing about his older brother. Rode had always cared only for him, even if Valero hated him. He was prepared for that. Suddenly, Valero put his sword to his brother's throat. The young man had already found his happiness. He was also obliged to free his older brother from his role. In order to become happy, Valero dreamed of becoming a knight since early childhood. Rodelvard was a good man, whom the young man emulated all his life. However, the man forbade his brother to follow the path he had chosen. It turned out that the brother was no different from his father. Rode did not understand why Valero voluntarily wanted to climb into the infernal cauldron and did not want to accept reality. Rodelvard asked his brother to remember Chris, who was an incredible fencer and former commander-in-chief. Mr. Blick's ambitions had gotten him nowhere. Rodelvard again began to argue with his brother that he had no talent for fencing. The young man immediately remembered Adila, who did everything quickly and skillfully. Mr. Blick was the complete opposite of Rodelvard. The man was perfect in everything. Chris was talented with a strong swordsman and also a wonderful commander. Watching Mr. Blick shine brightly, Rodelvard hated him more and more with every passing second. Lord Beck was just an ordinary envious man who ruined another's life because of his fear and addiction. If only Rode had known that he would encounter a man like Chris on that path, he would never have become a knight. Rodelvard, glaring at his brother, asked if he still wanted to become a worthy knight. His older brother had been arguing all his life about talent and that Valero should do what he was good at. But that wasn't the case. Perseverance and the desire to move on were more important than anything else. A quarrel broke out between the brothers. Each of them asserted his position and considered it correct. Valero admitted that for the first time, someone accepted him for who he really was, accepted his terrible character and stupid dreams. It was then that the young man swore that he would not let that person down and her faith in him. It was about the unsurpassed Adila. Whatever awaited Valero on his way, his father or the dark magicians, he did not want to run away from them. The young man thanked his brother for protecting him all this time. The time had come when Valero was ready to handle everything on his own. At that moment, Rode saw before him not his younger brother, but one who had finally grown up and was ready to move on without him. Rodelvard lowered his head in sorrow. Thinking about it, the man realized that all this time he had been the one who had kept Valero from getting out of the cage. Such thoughts made Lord Rode very sad. Meanwhile, events unfolded at the Ravel family estate. Finally seeing his daughter, the father was surprised and asked where she had been missing for several months. Embarrassed, the lady admitted that she had been at the estate all this time. The girl found it strange that her father had been looking for her. The lady hoped that her father would buy into her statement. Mr. Ravel apologized for disturbing his daughter at such an early hour and suggested that she go back to sleep. But Adila didn't want to. She noted that she had slept well on her brother's lap. The surprised father looked intently at his daughter. He couldn't believe that Sharon and Adila's relationship had improved. The girl asked Mr. Ravel to wait because she had a conversation with him. Adila wanted to talk about the dark magician who had taken up residence in the Knight's Order. Her father suggested that her daughter go to his office and calmly discuss everything. Mr. Ravel smiled at his daughter and said that he knew about everything. The girl was surprised because for some reason her father did not react at all. Unable to bear it, Adila confessed that in order to remove the blame from Mr. Chris, she changed into a man. Later, the lady joined the Order of Knights, but the father only nodded his head silently. It seemed that the information he heard did not surprise him at all. In her emotions, Adila told everything very loudly. The girl noted that she almost died because she was attacked by a dark magician. Then they wanted to accuse her of conspiring with dark magicians, and Chris stood up for her. Mr. Ravel calmly admitted that he knew everything because Sharon had told him. Adila was upset because she had asked her brother not to tell her father, and he had done such a mean thing to her. Mr. Ravel said that Mr. Chris's trial was set to begin soon, and if there is no solid evidence to exonerate him, the man will most likely face execution. Leaning back in her chair, Adila relaxedly said that Chris was definitely not guilty. The girl had solid proof. Mr. Ravel told his daughter that if they tried to save Mr. Chris, it could be the end of their family. Chris was highly respected by the common people, and if it turned out that he had been unjustly accused, A rebellion against the aristocrats would have broken out in the kingdom. Most of all, such events could affect the Beck family, especially the current head of the order, Rodelvard. The Beck family could be accused of having contacted dark magicians, and then Mr. Rode could be executed. The father also asked his daughter not to forget that the Beck and Ravel families were related. And such a situation could turn into a civil war for the kingdom. Mr. Ravel assumed that if they allowed Chris to be executed, the dark wizards would lose their vigilance and be confident that no one would be watching them anymore. Mr. Bleak's death was a necessity to preserve peace in the kingdom. Also in this case, the kingdom would be freed from the roots of evil without attracting attention. Adila was very indignant. She thought it was despicable to set Chris up. Mr. Ravel proposed to save the country by killing an innocent person. Lady reacted very sharply to such words of her father. But the man seemed calm and explained that in order to save everyone, it would be necessary to make a minimal sacrifice. The father looked intently at his daughter and asked her to prove to him, the head of the Ravel family, why they should protect Mr. Chris's life, risking their own life and reputation for his sake. Adila seemed to have water in her mouth. Still, she really wanted to prove to her father the value of Mr. Blick's life, because by saving him, the Ravel family would have benefited. Adila's hands were falling. She didn't know what to do and how to convince her father otherwise. Suddenly, the lady thought. She wondered why Sharon helped her in everything. The father was sure that sacrificing Chris would bring peace to the kingdom. But for some reason, Sharon wanted to help Adila save Mr. Bleak. Adila's impulsive actions made Valero worried, and Chris was taken to prison. Despite this, Brother Sharon supported the girl's thoughts and actions. No matter how you looked at it, all events were against Adila. She was the one who had caused so many problems, but had achieved nothing. It would have been much easier to not aggravate the situation and remain silent, but Lady Ravel did not want to sacrifice her friend. Adila speculated that the dark mage in the order specialized in persuasion magic. It even occurred to her that the commander-in-chief of the order might be kept as a puppet. The mages used subjugation magic on Lord Rode, and it was because of it that he accused Chris, framing him as the culprit. Adila said that as a family of powerful mages, they could have simply stopped the madness that the Beck family had succumbed to. Adila believed that in this way they could save Chris from execution, preserve the honor of the Beck family, and find the dark magician. The father looked at his daughter intently and asked if she was absolutely sure that everything would go according to her plan. The lady had no idea, actually, but she wanted to try to convince the judges not to execute Mr. Chris until the culprit was found. To convince the court to wait, the lady planned to provide evidence against Lady Misenst and her attackers. Evil had infiltrated the empire, and to stop it, renowned families of magicians and powerful swordsmen had to join forces to save the country. There was nothing more inspiring than two strong families standing guard over the safety and well-being of the citizens. Adila planned to save Chris's life in a way that would ensure that neither family would be harmed. Mr. Ravel believed that after declaring that the black magician really existed, he could simply hide, and this would greatly complicate the process of catching him. Adila believed that her father underestimated the power of the common people. Lady Ravel was convinced that if people learned the truth, then looking at the two strong families, they would unite and help find the magician. According to the lady, no one would ever believe that a man had turned to the dark side. Having learned that Chris could be saved from execution, the people who respected him would help. After listening to his daughter, Mr. Ravel still refused to act on her plan. He believed that if Adila announced her plan without any evidence, it would all be considered a lie. Still, the man admitted that his daughter had come up with a pretty sweet lie. Mr. Ravel laughed, thinking that Sharon had completely underestimated his sister. Adila gave her father the same answer as her brother. Mr. Ravel apologized and admitted that it was just a joke. The man just wanted to test his daughter's erudition. From the very beginning, he had planned to help Chris. Otherwise, he would not have allowed Sharon to help Adila and act so recklessly. Adila was angry because her father had made her experience a variety of emotions, including fear. Mr. Ravel explained it that both Adila and Sharon had grown up to be very good people and had good character traits. To challenge the royal family's accusations required considerable preparation. The Duke immediately warned his daughter that she would have to work on documents to file an appeal in court. Adila was ready for anything and happily agreed. For the next few days, the lady worked fruitfully on the documents. Her father did not lie that there would be a lot of work. Submitting evidence was easy, but formatting it correctly was quite difficult. Adila was giving up because she didn't understand much. The work with the documents turned out to be difficult. The lady was even more tired than in the nightly order. She was not even halfway through the documents, and a lot of time had already passed. Suddenly, the girl realized that it was easier to turn the damned dark magician into dust. The maid fan entered the room. This servant had been bullying Adila for years, but she finally got what she deserved. Fauna apologized and announced that Valero had arrived. The lady was surprised. Quickly gathering all the documents in order, the girl set off to meet the groom. Mr. Ravel was happy to welcome the young man into his home. Valero said that he had been busy for a long time, but had come on urgent business. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and Adila burst in screaming. The lady rushed to Valero. Mr. Ravel had no idea what his daughter was doing. He was seriously scared. The husband was convinced that his daughter had thrown her fist at Valero. But to the Duke's great surprise, she so joyfully threw herself into the groom's arms. Mr. Ravel was worried and asked Adila to behave more decently with Mr. Beck. Valero's mood really lifted. Adila was as cheerful and unpredictable as ever. Valero reminded the girl that he had promised to cooperate with her. Adila was delighted. Mr. Ravel watched everything in amazement. He could not believe that the same second son of the Beck family was sitting in front of him. The young man had completely changed. The last time Mr. Ravel visited the Duchy of Beck, the young man simply could not communicate properly with people. He constantly lost his temper and hit everyone. But that day, the Duke was faced with a completely different young man. He behaved like a normal person. Valero and Adila even joked around with each other like old friends. The young men noticed how impressed the Duke was. Mr. Ravel nevertheless asked why Valero had decided to come in person. The young man said that he had found the hideout of the dark magician. Adila was very happy to hear this news. Valero had brought a map with him. He unrolled it and decided to show everything clearly. There was a large shelter in the southeast of the Rideau forest. There was another, smaller one, in an ice cave on the border of Arentha and Xenon territory. The young man also pointed out a church in the town of Grador, which was also used as a shelter and place for secret meetings. The nearest shelter was on the road to the ruined castle of Leon. It was very close to the residence of the Ravel family. Adila was amazed because there was more than one hiding place. The Duke was surprised. He could not even think that all the dark magician's hiding places were located on the map provided. Mr. Ravel asked where Valero had gotten such valuable information. As it turned out, the map had been given to the young man by Rode's older brother. Silence fell in the room. Rodelvard did not plan to blindly trust the dark magicians. When he managed to contact them personally, the man also tracked their movements. In the envelope that Rode gave to Valero was a map with the location of all the dark cult's hideouts. When his older brother gave Valero such a valuable gift, the young man immediately wanted to quickly assemble a detachment to capture it. But Rodelvard warned that although he had gathered some data, the dark magicians were very cautious. Lord Rode suggested that they might have changed their shelters out of caution, and the man also noted that all the shelters were in the same area. The information provided significantly narrowed the search. Valero sincerely thanked his brother for such valuable information. Meanwhile, Rodelvard was about to head to the palace. He was ready to clear Chris of all charges and tell the truth. Valero wanted to go with his brother, but he refused. Lord Rode suggested that the young man go to the Ravel family and check the hiding places he had indicated on the map. Rodelvard noted that the family of magicians would be able to find the dark cult's hideout with so many clues. The Lord was also convinced that his brother's bride would be very happy about such news. Rode knew for sure that a happy smile would shine on Adila's lips. Valero was so lost in thought that he didn't hear a word Adila said. When he came to, the young man tried to gather his thoughts. The girl noticed that the young man was behaving strangely. Valero said that according to his brother, the dark cult could have changed its hideouts. Adila was upset because their map might not be useful at all. But Valero tried to cheer her up. Noting that the family of magicians would definitely be able to find magical traces and track the location of their enemies, Adila quickly came up with a plan. She was happy that Valero had arrived in time. The lady was just thinking about attacking the dark magicians, getting rid of them with one blow. The father understood his daughter's enthusiasm, but he was not ready to take her with him to track down the caches. The Duke was convinced that his daughter had not yet finished with the necessary documentation for the trial. Valero also supported Lord Beck and asked the girl to stay at the estate. The Duke noted that his daughter's task was to save Chris and, together with Sharon, prove his innocence to the entire kingdom. Adila did everything she could to cope with the task. The goal was clear to her. All that was left was to cheer up and finish everything once and for all. Lady Ravel was in high spirits. She raised her hand high and shouted words of joy. The Duke and Valero blinked silently. Mr. Ravel, intending to prepare for the investigation as quickly as possible, went into another room. Valero asked him to let him know when they were ready to leave. The young people were left alone. Adila approached the groom and asked if he had finally been able to talk frankly with his brother. Since Valero had the card, the lady was convinced that the conversation had taken place. The young man smiled and nodded his head affirmatively. Valero also thanked the girl for everything. He came closer and hugged his bride.